Imagine waking up one morning and your city is cut off from the outside world. No sure way out. Hardly any food. No electricity. Not a warm home. And an enemy is waiting outside, who not only wants to win, but is willing to let an entire city slowly starve. This is exactly what happened in Leningrad. For almost 900 days, millions of people lived in a city that was besieged, bombed, and starved. It was one of the cruelest episodes of the Second World War, and at the same time a story of fear, cold, hunger, despair, but also of resistance, cohesion, and a will to survive that still shakes today. But before we begin, I want to ask you a question. What do you think was worse in a besieged city? The hunger, the cold, or the constant fear of the next attack? Write your opinion in the comments below. I'm really interested in what you think about it. If you like historical topics that show not only dates and battles, but also the people behind them, then feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss any more stories about war, power, survival, and the dark decisions that have shaped our history. And with that, we begin with the story of the Siege of Leningrad, a city that was supposed to die and yet did not cease to live. Chapter 1, Prologue, a city on the edge of the abyss. In the summer of 1941, Leningrad was a city full of life, pride, and history. Anyone who walked through its wide streets saw not only houses, factories, bridges, and squares, but a city that for many people was more than a place on the map. Leningrad was a symbol. Here, as St. Petersburg, the power of the Tsars had once found its brilliant expression. There were palaces, museums, and cathedrals that told of imperial grandeur. This is where the Hermitage, one of the most important art museums in the world, was located. Canals ran here, facades were reflected in the water, European architecture was combined with Russian history. But since the revolution, the city has had a new name. It was called Leningrad, named after Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, and thus it had become not only a former capital of the Tsarist Empire, but also a political sanctuary of the Soviet Union. For the people who lived there, however, Leningrad was first and foremost their home. It was the city of the workers in the big armaments factories, the tram drivers, the saleswomen, the teachers, the students, the musicians, the mothers, the children, and the old people who still remembered earlier times. Machines were built in the factories, children were taught in the schools, plays were performed in the theaters, and in the homes people talked about everyday life, about prices, work, family, worries, and hopes. The city was modern and vulnerable at the same time. It was industrially important, culturally significant, and politically charged. It was precisely this mixture that made it a target that played a special role in the plans of Adolf Hitler and the German leadership. On June 22, 1941, the German attack on the Soviet Union began one of the most powerful and brutal military operations in history. Under the code name Operation Barbarossa, German troops crossed the Soviet border together with Allied forces. For many people in Leningrad, the news came as a shock, even though the threat of war had been in the air for a long time. The propaganda had proclaimed strength, the leadership had radiated control, but suddenly the war was no longer something distant that existed in newspapers or speeches. He came closer, day by day, front line by front line, village by village, city by city. The German Army Group North received the order to advance towards Leningrad. Their path led through the Baltic states, over rivers, roads, and railway lines, through areas where Soviet troops were partly overrun, partly cut off, partly tied up in heavy fighting. The German advance was frighteningly fast in the first few weeks. Entire Soviet units came under pressure, communication lines collapsed, orders came too late or were already outdated by the time they reached the front. From the beginning, the war that the German leadership waged in the East was more than an ordinary war between states. It was characterized by racist ideology, political annihilation, and economic exploitation. Leningrad was seen in this thinking not only as a military obstacle, but as a city whose very existence was considered a problem. In Leningrad, the approaching danger was initially felt in small changes. Men were drafted. Factories changed their production. Air raid drills became more serious. Windows were darkened. Art treasures were packed or stored. People stood in front of billboards, listened to radio speeches, and tried to understand how quickly their world was changing. Many still believed that the Red Army would stop the enemy. Others suspected that the situation was more serious than was officially said. But hardly anyone could imagine what was in store for the city. No one could really understand that Leningrad would soon no longer be just a frontline city, but a huge prison of stone, hunger, cold, and fear. The city began to prepare for defense. Fortifications were erected, anti-tank ditches dug, barricades prepared. Workers, students, and women helped build defenses. Production continued in the factories, often under growing pressure. The Soviet leadership knew that Leningrad could not fall. Its loss would have been militarily difficult, because the city was an important industrial center and controlled important transport routes. But the symbolic catastrophe would have been even greater. A city that bore Lenin's name was not allowed to fall into the hands of the National Socialists. For Stalin, for the party, and for Soviet propaganda, Leningrad was a test of steadfastness. But behind the big words were people of flesh and blood. A mother who was shopping for groceries and didn't know how long supplies would last. A father who received a call-up and had to leave his family behind. A child who first perceived the war as the restlessness of adults and only later understood that this restlessness meant fear. An old man who had already experienced revolution and civil war and now felt history breaking into his private life again. The war didn't just come with tanks and planes. He came into conversation, into faces, into insomnia, into gathering water, bread, and firewood, into the sound of sirens and waiting for news. As the German troops approached, the atmosphere in Leningrad changed. The city was not yet encircled, but it already felt threatened. The authorities organized evacuations, but these were not easy and insufficient. Many people did not want to leave. Others couldn't. Some believed that the danger would soon pass. Some had relatives who did not want to leave them behind. Some were bound by work obligations. Children were brought to safety, but not all transports were safe, and not all decisions proved to be correct. The war made every election a risk. Meanwhile, the German leadership discussed not only the capture of the city, but its future after the victory. In the plans of the National Socialists, Leningrad had hardly any future. The city should not continue to exist as a lively metropolis. Their population was seen as a burden, not as a life worth protecting. The idea of letting millions of people perish through hunger, shelling, and isolation was not an accident of war, but part of a brutal logic. This fact makes the siege of Leningrad so shocking. It was not only a consequence of military circumstances, but an expression of a war in which entire populations were disenfranchised and left to die. In September 1941, the ring around Leningrad closed. German troops reached decisive positions in the south and southwest, while Finnish forces were stationed in the north, pursuing their own goals and cutting off the city from land connections. The last direct land routes were interrupted. From then on, Leningrad was largely isolated. Lake Ladoga remained a vital connection, but this route was also dangerous, inadequate, and dependent on the weather, organization, and military situation. For the people of the city, a time began that was to exceed anything they could have imagined before. The siege was not immediately visible in all its cruelty. In the beginning, there were still supplies, still movement, still hope for a quick breakthrough. Many believed that the situation would stabilize. But supplies were limited, the number of people large, and the supply situation catastrophic. Soon bread became no longer just food, but the measure of life. One ration could decide whether someone could survive another day. Hunger began slowly, then relentlessly, to dominate everyday life. He changed bodies, thoughts, relationships, and morals. What had previously been taken for granted became precious. A piece of bread, a warm room, a liter of water, a message from relatives, a moment without shelling. Leningrad was now on the brink of the abyss. The city had not fallen, but it was trapped. Its inhabitants lived between the front and the leadership, between German extermination planning and Soviet perseverance, between hope and despair. The proud metropolis became a place where millions of people had to learn to live with the unimaginable. The siege of Leningrad became one of the greatest civilian tragedies of the Second World War, and at the same time a symbol of resilience in conditions that hardly anyone could bear. But this story does not begin with hunger, and not only with death. It begins with a city that lived before it was enclosed. With streets where people walked without knowing that they would soon be covered in snow, rubble, and corpses. With apartments in which families sat without knowing that heat and food would soon disappear. With a population that hoped, feared, worked, and waited. Leningrad was to be starved and broken according to the will of its enemies. But before you can understand how the city survived, you have to understand what it was. A city full of history, full of people and full of meaning, which suddenly became the scene of a struggle that was not just about territory, but about life, memory, and humanity. Chapter 2: Leningrad before the war. Before the German attack on the Soviet Union, Leningrad was much more than a large city in the northwest of the country. It was a place where Russian history, Soviet ideology, European culture, and industrial power combined in a special way. If you want to understand Leningrad, you have to understand that this city has always had a double meaning. It was a living space for millions of people, but at the same time a political symbol. It was a workers' town and museum city, armament center and cultural metropolis, former Tsar's residence and sanctuary of the revolution. These contrasts made Leningrad unique and explained why its fate took on such tremendous significance during World War II. Originally, the city was founded under the name of St. Petersburg by Tsar Peter the Great. It was supposed to be Russia's window to Europe, a sign that the Russian Empire was looking not only to the east but also to the west. Its location on the Neva, near the Baltic Sea, made it strategically important and economically valuable. It was connected to Europe via ports, canals, and trade routes. Their architecture was more reminiscent of Amsterdam, Stockholm, or Vienna than of the old Russian cities in the interior. Wide facades, classicist facades, palaces, bridges, squares, and watercourses gave it a special face. But behind this beauty there was always power. St. Petersburg did not come into being by chance. It had been planned, built, and erected with enormous human sacrifices in order to make Russia's claim as a European great power visible. After the revolution of 1917, the importance of the city changed fundamentally. Revolutionary events had taken place here. Strikes, demonstrations, and political struggles had become symbols of a new age. Petrograd later became Leningrad, named after Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution. This name made the city a place of remembrance of Soviet power. It no longer stood only for Tsarist greatness, but for the claim to create a new society. At the same time, the past remained visible everywhere. The palaces did not disappear, the museums remained, the squares and facades continued to tell of the old world. So the city lived with a tension that could be felt everywhere. It was supposed to be socialist, but it bore the stone heritage of the empire. In the 1930s, Leningrad was an important industrial city. Their factories produced machines, turbines, ships, weapons, optical devices, and equipment for the Soviet economy and military. The Kirov plant was one of the most important industrial facilities in the city and became a symbol of Soviet workforce. In such factories, technical progress, political pressure, and harsh working conditions were combined. Soviet industrialization had changed the country, but it was associated with violence, scarcity, coercion, and enormous human burdens. Workers were celebrated, but they often lived in difficult conditions. Housing was scarce, food supplies remained strained, and the political climate was one of control and fear. Leningrad was also a city of education and science. Universities, institutes, technical schools, and research institutions shaped intellectual life. Engineers, doctors, historians, physicists, architects, and artists worked here. The city had an educated population, a strong cultural tradition, and a self-confidence that grew out of its history. Plays were played in theaters, orchestras gave concerts, libraries were filled, museums preserved works of art of worldwide importance. The Hermitage was not only a museum, but a treasure house of European and Russian culture. For many Leningraders, culture was not a luxury, but a part of their identity. Even in a politically strictly controlled society, this cultural depth remained alive. But life in Leningrad before the war was by no means free of shadows. The city had experienced the consequences of the revolution, the civil war, the economic upheavals, and the Stalinist rule. The 1930s were marked by repression. Arrests, denunciations, show trials, and fear did not pass Leningrad by. Many families knew someone who had disappeared, been convicted, or had been deported to camps. Everyday life was determined by caution. People did not speak openly everywhere, did not trust everyone, and knew that a wrong word could be dangerous. This experience shaped society. People learned to distinguish between public language and private thinking. They learned to adapt, to remain silent, or only to make hints. Nevertheless, Leningrad was a city where life went on. Children went to school, students sat in lecture halls, workers stood at machines, families celebrated birthdays, couples went for walks, old people talked about the past. There was bargaining on the markets, people were crowding into trams, and several families shared the kitchen and hallway in communal apartments. Everyday life was often cramped, tedious, and simple, but it had its order. It is precisely this normality that makes the later collapse so shattering. The people who were soon to starve, freeze, and die were not abstract numbers of victims. They were inhabitants of a lively city with habits, professions, memories, hopes, and small private pleasures. Leningrad's geographical location made the city both strong and vulnerable. It was close to the Baltic Sea, close to Finland, close to the borders that had taken on a new meaning after the First World War and the political upheavals in Eastern Europe. The Soviet leadership knew that Leningrad could be endangered in the event of war. The proximity to Finland in particular played an important role. In the Winter War from 1939 to 1940, the Soviet Union attacked Finland in order to push its border further away from Leningrad and gain strategic security. Although the Soviet Union made territorial gains, the war also revealed the weaknesses of the Red Army and left deep hostility in its wake. For Finland, the loss of territory meant an open wound. For the Soviet Union, Leningrad remained vulnerable despite the new borders. Militarily, the city was of great importance. Their industry could be used for armaments, their location controlled access to the Baltic Sea, and their loss would have hit the Soviet defenses in the north hard. At the same time, Leningrad was vulnerable due to its supply lines. A large city with millions of inhabitants could not live on its own. It needed grain, fuel, raw materials, spare parts, and transport from other parts of the Soviet Union. Railway lines, roads, and waterways were vital. If these connections were broken, the strength of the city could quickly become weak. Their size then did not mean power, but hunger. Before the war, however, many people did not believe in a catastrophe of such proportions. Soviet propaganda had painted the picture of a strong state, an army that would throw back any aggressor, a leadership that was prepared. Although there were rumors, fears, and international tensions, public life continued to follow its course. The German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939 had unsettled many people, but at the same time gave the impression that the immediate war with Germany might be avoidable. That Hitler would nevertheless attack the Soviet Union was conceivable to some, but the speed and brutality of the attack exceeded the expectations of many. As the war approached, Leningrad was a city full of contradictions. It was beautiful and tense, proud and vulnerable, culturally rich and politically controlled, industrially powerful and dependent on supplies. Its inhabitants had already experienced hard times, but they could not have known that they were in for an experience that would be extraordinarily gruesome, even on the scale of World War II. The later hunger, the cold, and the death seem even more harrowing when you look at the city before the siege. The trams that ran over the prospects, the students in the classrooms, the workers at the workbenches, the visitors in museums, the families in overcrowded apartments, the people on the Neva who watched the White Nights. Before the war, Leningrad was not a city waiting for its end. It was a lively metropolis with a past and a future, with pride and vulnerability, with glamour and fear. Precisely for this reason, their siege became more than a military episode. It became an attack on an urban organism, on a population, on memory and culture. When the German troops came closer in 1941, they not only threatened factories and defensive positions. They threatened a city that was home to its inhabitants and a symbol of the Soviet Union. What would soon follow was not just the fight for a place, but an attempt to starve a city, break its people, and erase its importance. Leningrad entered the war as a symbol of the revolution and as a proud metropolis of the North. It was to leave him as a wounded, traumatized, and yet surviving city. Chapter 3: Hitler's War in the East. When Adolf Hitler launched the attack on the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, it was not simply the next military step in an already unleashed world war. The invasion of the Soviet Union was the core of what Hitler had been thinking, planning, and ideologically preparing for many years. For him, the war in the East was no ordinary war over borders, raw materials, or military bases. It was an ideological war, a war of annihilation, a fight against Bolshevism, against the Soviet state system, and against people who were considered inferior in National Socialist ideology. This mixture of power politics, racial fanaticism, economic hunger, and military megalomania was the special cruelty of the campaign. The attack on Leningrad can only be understood if one understands this larger context. Hitler's view of Eastern Europe was shaped by the idea that Germany had to gain living space there. In practice, this slogan meant the violent subjugation of vast territories, the exploitation of their resources, and the expulsion, enslavement, or extermination of millions of people. The Soviet Union appeared to the National Socialist leadership not only as a military opponent, but also as an ideological archenemy. Bolshevism was portrayed as a Jewish-directed threat, although this idea was based on anti-Semitic propaganda and had nothing to do with sober political analysis. It was precisely this propaganda that made it possible to present the war in the East as a struggle without normal rules. Anyone who no longer sees the enemy as an equal human being, but as a danger to be destroyed, opens the door to violence without borders. Even before the attack, plans were prepared that showed how radically this war was to be waged. The German Wehrmacht did not march into the Soviet Union alone as a classic army. It was followed by task forces, police units, administrative staffs, and business organizations. They were supposed to murder political opponents, destroy Jewish communities, secure food and raw materials, and squeeze the occupied territories for German interests. The military front and terror in the rear belonged together. So the war was not just a sequence of battles. It was a system of occupation, hunger, deportation, and murder. For the German leadership, the attack on the Soviet Union had several goals. Militarily, the Red Army was to be destroyed in rapid encirclement battles before it could retreat deep inland. Economically, Germany wanted to gain access to grain, oil, coal, ores, and labor. Politically, the Soviet Union was to be smashed as a power factor. Ideologically, the so-called Jewish Bolshevism was to be extinguished. These goals were interconnected. The German victory was not only to defeat an opponent, but to create a new order in Europe, in which Germany ruled and the peoples of the East were subordinated. The plan for the attack was called Operation Barbarossa. 3 large army groups were to advance into the Soviet Union. Army Group Central aimed at Moscow, Army Group South at Ukraine and later at the raw material areas in the south, Army Group North at the Baltic states and Leningrad. This division alone showed how enormous the German claim was. Within a few months, a huge country was to be broken militarily. Hitler and many of his generals expected a quick victory. The experiences from Poland, France, and other campaigns had strengthened the belief in the German leadership that rapid operations, tank formations, air superiority, and operational mobility could overwhelm any opponent. But the Soviet Union was not an opponent like France or Poland. Their area was huge, their population large, their industry partly far inland, and their leadership was willing to accept enormous sacrifices. Nevertheless, the German attack initially hit the Soviet Union with devastating force. The Red Army had been weakened by the Stalinist purges, and many experienced officers had been arrested, shot, or intimidated. The military leadership was often uncertain, orders were contradictory, and Stalin himself had long underestimated the danger of an immediate attack, despite many warnings. When the Wehrmacht crossed the border, numerous Soviet aircraft were already destroyed on the ground, units were surprised, and large formations were surrounded. In this storm, Leningrad very quickly became one of the most important targets. The city was important for several reasons. It was a large industrial center, especially for armaments, mechanical engineering, and shipbuilding. It was strategically important at the entrance to the Baltic Sea. Her case could have facilitated the connection between German and Finnish forces. At the same time, it had a tremendous symbolic value. Leningrad bore the name of Lenin. For the National Socialists, it was not only a Soviet city, but a monument to Bolshevism. Their capture or destruction would have had enormous propaganda significance. So it was not just a matter of shifting a front line. It was about breaking a symbol. Army Group North under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb advanced through the Baltic states after the start of the attack. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia became the transit area of a war that brought with it its own hopes, fears, and tragedies for many people there. Some initially saw the Germans as liberators from Soviet rule, but it soon became clear that the Nazi occupation did not bring freedom at all. Violence, mass murder of Jews, political persecution, and economic exploitation accompanied the advance. While the tanks and infantry units pushed northeast, terror spread behind them. Leningrad thus found itself in an increasingly dangerous situation. The city was not deep inland, but close to the western and northern borders. In addition, Finland played a special role. The Soviet Union had attacked Finland in the Winter War from 1939 to 1940 and conquered territories to better protect Leningrad. For Finland, this loss was a deep national wound. When Germany attacked the Soviet Union in 1941, Finland re-entered the war on the German side, even if the Finnish goals were not completely identical to the German ones. Finland wanted above all to regain lost territory and strengthen its own security. Nevertheless, the Finnish participation considerably exacerbated the threat to Leningrad, because the city now also came under pressure in the north. Hitler's decisions against Leningrad were particularly cruel. At first, it could still be assumed that the Wehrmacht was to conquer the city. But it soon became clear that a classic revenue with street fighting, occupation, and supply of the population was not desired. The German leadership did not want to adopt the city as a living space. They wanted to isolate them, shoot at them, and starve them. The idea behind it was cold and murderous. A city of millions that is not supplied will collapse sooner or later. For the people of Leningrad, this meant that they were not only caught between two armies, but became the target of a deliberate hunger policy. This decision could not be explained solely by military means. Of course, the capture of such a large city could have caused high losses. Of course, the siege tied up Soviet forces. But the harshness of German planning went far beyond that. It arose from an ideology in which Soviet civilians did not deserve protection. Hunger was used as a weapon. The population was not seen as a responsibility, but as a problem that should disappear. Leningrad thus became one of the clearest examples of how closely military strategy and National Socialist extermination policy were linked in the East. On the Soviet side, the threat to Leningrad was recognized with growing concern. Stalin and the party leadership knew that the fall of the city would be a catastrophe, not only militarily, but also morally. If Leningrad, the city of Lenin, had fallen into German hands, it would have deeply shaken the Soviet population and given German propaganda a tremendous triumph. Therefore, defense became a political duty. The city had to be held, whatever the cost. This attitude gave the defense an enormous determination, but it also brought with it a harshness that the population was to suffer. So from the beginning, the war in the East was a war in which cities, villages, and civilians were not on the margins, but at the center of the violence. Leningrad became the focal point of this development. This is where Hitler's will to annihilate, German military strategy, Finnish interests, Soviet perseverance, and the lives of millions of people came together. The city was not simply besieged because there was a front line there. It was besieged because it was a symbol in the eyes of its enemies that was to be extinguished. As the German troops approached in the late summer of 1941, abstract ideology began to transform into concrete reality. What had been planned and formulated in orders in Berlin became sirens, impacts, cut-off paths, falling rations, and growing fear for the people of Leningrad. Hitler's war in the East reached the city not only with tanks and artillery. He reached it as the idea that an entire population was expendable. This was precisely the deepest cruelty of the coming siege. Leningrad was not only to be defeated militarily. It was to be starved, humiliated, and broken. But the city, which was a symbol of Bolshevism for its enemies, was something completely different for its inhabitants: home, memory, everyday life, and life. Between these two points of view, the abyss opened into which Leningrad was now being pushed. Chapter 4: The Advance of Army Group North. When the German Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, a danger began for Leningrad that at first seemed far away, but was approaching with frightening speed. Army Group North, led by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, had the task of advancing through the Baltic states towards Leningrad. This attack was part of the massive Operation Barbarossa, but it had a special significance in the north. While Army Group Center aimed at Moscow and Army Group South at Ukraine, Army Group North was supposed to secure access to the Baltic Sea, smash Soviet forces in the Baltic states, and finally threaten Leningrad. For the German leadership, this advance was not just a military operation. It was the path to a city that, in their imagination, was to be destroyed politically, symbolically, and ideologically. In the first days of the campaign, the German plan seemed to be working. The Wehrmacht had gained enormous experience from the previous campaigns. Their tank units, motorized units, and air forces worked closely together. They advanced rapidly, broke through Soviet lines, bypassed pockets of resistance, and repeatedly forced opposing units into retreat or encirclement. In the Baltics, they encountered Soviet units that were numerically significant, but suffered from the problems that burdened the Red Army almost everywhere during this phase of the war. Orders came too late, communications were lost, many commanders were unsure, and the Soviet Air Force had already suffered heavy losses in the first few hours. The Stalinist purges of recent years had weakened the officer corps, and the fear of wrong decisions paralyzed the initiative in many places. For the people in the Baltic regions, the German advance meant a chaotic and contradictory experience. Some inhabitants of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia initially associated the German attack with the hope of liberation from Soviet rule, because the Soviet occupation had brought deportations, repression, and political violence. But this hope quickly proved to be deceptive. The National Socialist occupation did not bring freedom, but a new form of brutal rule. Behind the fighting troops followed Einsatzgruppen, police units and administrative units that persecuted political opponents and systematically murdered Jewish communities. The military advance and the terror in the rear were not separate developments. They belonged to the same war, in which conquest, exploitation, and annihilation intertwined. Army Group North advanced via Kaunas, Daugavpils, Pskov, and other important transport axes. Panzergruppe 4 under General Erich Hopner played a central role. Their task was to quickly penetrate deep into Soviet space, blow up Soviet defense lines, and open the way to Leningrad. The advance did not take place without resistance. The Red Army fought stubbornly in many places, and heavy fighting broke out again and again. But in the initial phase, the Soviet defenders often lacked the coordination to stop the German thrust permanently. Entire units were overrun or had to retreat in a hurry. For the German leadership, this reinforced the illusion that the war in the East could be decided in a few months. But the limits of this expectation were already evident in the advance on Leningrad. The distances were great, the distances poor, the supply difficult. The further the German troops advanced, the longer their supply lines became. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food had to be brought over destroyed roads, damaged bridges, and inadequate railway connections. The Soviet gauge of the railway differed from the German one, which caused additional problems. At the same time, retreating Soviet forces left behind destroyed infrastructure. The rapid advance thus generated not only military successes, but also growing burdens. Tanks could advance far, but they remained dependent on supplies, repairs, and infantry, which often followed more slowly. On the Soviet side, Leningrad was increasingly recognized as a threatened center. The city was not behind the infinite depths of the country, but comparatively close to the western attack routes. The Soviet leadership began to strengthen defensive measures. Workers, students, women, and young people were called upon to build fortifications. Anti-tank ditches, barriers, trenches, and defense lines were built under great time pressure. Many people who had previously worked in factories, offices, or schools suddenly found themselves on the outskirts of the city or further out in the countryside with shovels in their hands. As a result, the war became physically noticeable. It was no longer just a message from the front, but a task that demanded strength, fear, and obedience every day. From the very beginning, the defense of Leningrad was not only militarily but also politically charged. The city bore the name of Lenin. Their loss would have been a blow to the Soviet Union's self-image. Therefore, there was enormous pressure to keep them at all costs. At the same time, Soviet decisions were often marked by harshness and chaos. Evacuations began, but were incomplete and contradictory. Many children and civilians were not brought to safety in time. Factories were to continue production, even as the front line approached. The authorities vacillated between reassuring the population and mobilizing through fear. Officially, confidence was spread, but in the background many responsible persons knew that the situation was becoming more and more serious. The German advance continued to gain pressure in July and August 1941. Army Group North approached the Leningrad area step by step. The location in the north also played an important role. Finland, which had lost territory to the Soviet Union in the Winter War, now entered the war again against the Soviet Union. The Finnish leadership pursued its own goals, above all the recovery of lost territories and the securing of its own borders. Nevertheless, the Finnish advance seemed threatening to Leningrad because it narrowed the city from the north. This created a strategic situation in which Leningrad came under pressure not only from German forces in the south and southwest, but also from Finnish forces in the north. The city began to close like a trap. For the people of Leningrad, the war now became more and more concrete. Refugees reached the city, bringing with them reports of destroyed places, rapid German advances, and cruel occupation practices. Train stations were overcrowded, streets full of soldiers, columns of workers and transports. Food became scarcer, even if the actual hunger of the siege had not yet begun. Air strikes and artillery danger were getting closer. Many families had to decide whether to stay or go. But this decision was often only seemingly free. Those who had work obligations could not simply leave. Those who had to care for old relatives stayed. Those who believed the propaganda hoped for an early stabilization. Those who wanted to leave did not always find a place on the evacuation trains. Meanwhile, the German leadership was faced with the question of how to proceed with Leningrad. A direct storming of a city of millions would have meant heavy losses. Street fighting in such a metropolis could wear down any army. But the alternative that emerged in German planning was even more cruel. The city was to be enclosed and starved. The enemy should not have to be fought in every house. Instead, hunger, cold, shelling, and isolation should take over the work. This idea shows how much the war in the East was marked by the dissolution of moral boundaries. Civilians were not seen as people who deserved protection, but as a mass whose survival was undesirable for the German leadership. Militarily, the German advance slowed down the closer it came to Leningrad. The Soviet resistance became stronger, the terrain more difficult, the supply more tense. Leningrad was not an isolated point that simply had to be reached on a map. In order to threaten the city, roads, rivers, railway lines, Suburbs and defensive areas had to be controlled. The Soviet troops threw more and more forces into the defense, often poorly equipped and with high losses. For many soldiers, this meant battles in which retreat was hardly allowed and perseverance became mandatory. The harshness of Soviet defense arose not only from patriotism, but also from the pressure of a state that could interpret defeat as betrayal. In August 1941, the situation escalated dramatically. The German associations were getting closer and closer to the entrances to the city. The connection between Leningrad and the rest of Soviet territory became more uncertain. The supply situation deteriorated, and the city administration had to prepare for a situation that was almost impossible to manage. There was still hope for counterattacks, for relief, for a stabilization of the front. But in reality, Leningrad was heading for disaster. The speed of the German advance had taken the Soviet leadership by surprise, and the time that would have been necessary for evacuation, stockpiling, and orderly defense was largely lost. When the last land connections were threatened and finally interrupted, the advance of Army Group North turned into the beginning of a siege. What had begun as a quick operation did not lead to the immediate capture of the city, but to its encirclement. This changed the character of the war for Leningrad. Movement turned into blockade. Frontline fighting turned into a hunger war. Military pressure turned into a long-lasting test for millions of people. Army Group North had not fully achieved its goal, because Leningrad did not fall. But it had pushed the city to the brink of the abyss. The advance on Leningrad shows how closely military planning, ideological hatred, and human suffering were linked. 4 German staffs. These were lines of operations, supply issues, and maps. For the Soviet leadership, they were orders, defense zones, and political symbols. For the population, however, every kilometer that came closer to the front was a step into a world in which normal life was shattered. Leningrad was not suddenly besieged. The siege grew from weeks of advance, fear, wrong decisions, and violence. When the ring finally closed, the city was not only encircled militarily. She had been drawn into a historical tragedy, the extent of which no one could fully comprehend at the time. Chapter 5. The Ring Closes. In September 1941, the threat to Leningrad reached the point where a rapid German advance turned into a long and deadly siege. For weeks, the people in the city had heard news from the front, picked up rumors, seen refugees, and felt how the war was getting closer and closer around them. But as long as roads were still open, as long as trains could still run, as long as there were still connections to the rest of the country, there was a remnant of hope. One could persuade oneself that the situation was serious, but not final. One could believe that the Red Army would stop the German units in time. One could hope that evacuation, supply, and defense would somehow be ordered. However, when the last land connections were interrupted, everything changed. Leningrad was no longer just a threatened city. Leningrad was surrounded. The decisive moment came in early September 1941, when German troops reached the area around Schlüsselburg on Lake Ladoga, cutting off the direct land connection between Leningrad and the rest of Soviet territory. This closed the ring in the south and southeast of the city. To the north were Finnish troops who had regained lost territory after the Soviet-Finnish Winter War and were now narrowing the city from the north. Even though the Finnish leadership did not strive for the complete destruction of Leningrad in the same way as Hitler, its military presence was of enormous importance for the city. It contributed to the fact that Leningrad was hardly accessible from land. What remained was Lake Ladoga, a body of water that meant hope and danger at the same time. Theoretically, it was possible to keep in touch through it, but this connection was uncertain, limited, and at the mercy of the weather, German attacks, and organizational difficulties. For the German leadership, the encirclement was a strategic success. Army Group North had not taken Leningrad by direct storm, but it had cut off the city from the most important supply routes. In classical military terms, a siege was a means of forcing a fortress to surrender. But Leningrad was not a medieval fortress with a limited garrison, but a huge modern city with millions of people. This was precisely the cruelty of the situation. The blockade did not only affect soldiers, commanders, and factories. She met children, the sick, the elderly, mothers, workers, teachers, musicians, saleswomen, civil servants, and people who had nothing to do with military decisions. The ring around Leningrad was a military event, but its consequences were above all human. Within the city, the transition to siege was initially difficult to understand. Life did not completely collapse in a single day. Trams were still running, people went to work, factories continued to produce, authorities gave instructions, newspapers appeared, loudspeakers spread messages. But beneath this surface, the character of everyday life changed fundamentally. Everyone now knew that the city could no longer breathe freely. Food, fuel, medicines, and spare parts could no longer be brought in sufficient quantities. The supplies that were available had to last for an uncertain time. No one knew whether the siege would last weeks, months, or longer. It was precisely this uncertainty that ate its way into people's thoughts. Hunger and cold had not yet reached their worst form, but their shadows were already over the city. The supply situation was catastrophically prepared from the beginning. Leningrad was a city of millions whose population depended on regular supplies. The city could not feed itself. Their supplies were limited, and many stocks had not been adequately secured due to the rapid German advance, poor planning, and inadequate evacuation. Particularly serious was the fact that German airstrikes hit important food warehouses in September. The fire in the Besieged warehouses later became a grim symbol of the incipient famine. In the memory of many Leningraders, this fire was associated with the feeling that the city was losing its reserves before their own eyes. Historically, it was later discussed how large the actual share of these camps in the total supply was, but psychologically the effect was enormous. Smoke rose over the city, and many people understood that the war had now reached their plates. The Soviet authorities introduced a rationing system, which soon became the crucial question of survival. Bread became the measure of all things. It was not simply a food, but the visible sign of whether the state could still feed its citizens. The amount of rations depended on the work category, age, and function. Workers in important factories received more than employees, children, or dependent family members, but even higher rations could hardly ensure survival over time. Even in this early phase, a social order of hunger emerged. Those who worked in an important company, who had access to additional resources, who had connections or were still physically strong enough had better chances. Those who were old, sick, alone, or without influence were more likely to be in danger. The siege hit everyone, but it didn't hit everyone equally. At the same time, Leningrad remained a frontline city. German artillery was able to shell parts of the city, and airstrikes threatened residential neighborhoods, factories, train stations, and utilities. The war was no longer just outside on a line, but reached into the interior of the city. People had to run into shelters, windows were darkened, buildings were damaged, roads blocked. But even under fire, work continued. The factories were of military importance, and the Soviet leadership demanded that production be maintained as much as possible. Tanks, ammunition, weapons, and spare parts were needed. Leningrad was not only to survive, but to continue fighting. For many workers, this meant that they had to return to their jobs after airstrikes, hunger, and fear. The boundary between civilian life and military service became blurred. The political leadership of the city was faced with an almost impossible task. It had to reassure the population and mobilize it at the same time. It had to generate perseverance without fully revealing the truth. She had to organize the care, even though the basics of care were breaking down. It had to maintain evacuations, defense, production, and order at the same time. In such situations, decisions are made that are difficult to judge later. Some measures were necessary, others were hard, chaotic, or inadequate. The Soviet leadership thought in terms of state, front, and victory. For the individual, however, it was about bread, warmth, security, and the question of whether relatives would live to see the next day. While the ring closed, the mental landscape of the city also changed. At the beginning of the siege, there were still many illusions. Some believed that the confinement would soon be broken. Others hoped that the Germans would storm the city after all, and that the state of insecurity would somehow end. Still others trusted in the strength of the Red Army or in the toughness of the Soviet leadership. But the longer the days passed, the clearer it became that the city had entered a different time. A time when every news item from the front was greedily received, when rumors were almost as powerful as official reports, when people stood in lines in front of food banks, looking for signs of hope or despair in faces. The German decision not simply to conquer Leningrad, but to break it by blockade, turned the city into an experiment in inhumanity. Hunger became a weapon. The city was not to negotiate, not to be occupied normally, and not to be supplied. She was to slowly perish from her isolation. For the German leadership, this was also a question of their own expediency. A conquered city of millions would have had to be supplied, controlled, and managed. A besieged city, on the other hand, could be left to die. This logic shows how deeply the National Socialist War in the East was marked by the dissolution of moral boundaries. Leningrad was treated not only as a military target, but as a living space whose population was to have no future. But at the same time, something began inside the city that German planning underestimated. People adapted, even if the circumstances were cruel. Neighborhoods organized, families pooled supplies, authorities set up new structures. Workers stayed at machines, soldiers held positions, doctors treated the wounded, teachers tried to keep children busy, artists looked for ways to keep culture completely silent. This adaptation was not romantic. It was often desperate, hard, and marked by fear. But it showed that a city is not just streets, buildings, and camps. It consists of relationships, habits, duties, and memories. As long as these do not break down completely, a form of life remains even under the worst conditions. Lake Ladoga now became the last great hope. The later road of life was not yet organized in its familiar form, but it was already clear that this lake could make the difference between life and death. It had to be used to get food into the city and people to get out of the city. But waterways were vulnerable. German planes could attack ships, storms could prevent transports, ports were overloaded, and the quantities were not sufficient to meet the needs of a city of millions. The lake was not a safe escape route, but a dangerous breath. Nevertheless, many clung to him, because without this connection Leningrad would have been completely cut off. As autumn approached, few had any idea of the horrors that winter would bring. People knew that the situation was serious, but the idea that hunger, frost, and exhaustion would soon dominate the cityscape was beyond imagination. There were still sounds of normal life, buildings were still standing, companies were still working, people were still talking about relief and counterattacks. But underneath everything lay the new truth: the ring was closed. Leningrad was trapped. From then on, every day was a struggle against external enemies and against the internal disintegration of a besieged city. The moment when the ring around Leningrad closed was therefore more than a military section on a map. It was the beginning of one of the largest civilian disasters of the Second World War. The city became a space in which strategy and hunger, politics and dying, propaganda and everyday life were inextricably linked. For the German planners, the inclusion was a means to an end. For the Soviet leadership, it was a test of perseverance. For the residents, however, it meant a new reality in which the simplest things in life suddenly became uncertain. Bread, water, warmth, light, exercise, sleep, and hope became precious goods. Leningrad was no longer just on the edge of the abyss. It had been drawn into him, and no one knew how deep this abyss would become. Chapter 6: Decision to Starve. The siege of Leningrad was not only the result of a military advance that came to a halt on the borders of a major city. It was also the result of a conscious decision. This decision was one of the cruelest of the entire war in the East. Leningrad was not simply to be conquered, administered, or occupied. The city was to be surrounded, shelled, and starved. For the German leadership, the population was not something that had to be protected or cared for after an intake. It was seen as a burden, as an undesirable mass, as part of a hostile space that was not given a future. Thus, hunger did not become the accidental consequence of a siege, but a weapon. In previous wars, there had been repeated sieges in which cities were surrounded and forced to surrender due to shortages. But Leningrad was not a fortress from a bygone era. It was a modern city of millions, a place with children, hospitals, schools, factories, museums, residential buildings, and densely packed communal housing. Cutting off such a city inevitably meant triggering a catastrophe among the civilian population. This is exactly what the German leadership was aware of. The question was not whether hunger would arise. The question was whether they wanted to prevent this hunger. The answer of the National Socialist leadership was no. Hitler's war against the Soviet Union was characterized by a special dissolution of boundaries from the beginning. It aimed not only to defeat the Red Army, but also to smash the Soviet state, exploit its resources, and deprive large parts of its population of rights. In this way of thinking, the focus was not on people as individuals, but as categories. Bolsheviks, Jews, Slavs, commissars, partisans, civilians in occupied territories. The language of ideology turned people into enemy images, and enemy images became death sentences. Leningrad fitted into this logic in a particularly brutal way. The city bore the name of Lenin. It was a symbol of the revolution, an industrial center, and a political sign. For Hitler, it was not just a place, but a symbol that was to be erased. The German leadership saw several problems in a direct capture of the city. Street fighting in Leningrad could have caused enormous losses. Every street, every factory site, every large building could have been defended. The Wehrmacht had already experienced how tenaciously Soviet troops could fight when they stood in urban or fortified areas. At the same time, a conquered city would have had to be supplied. Millions of people needed bread, water, medicine, and fuel. For a Germany that in the East anyway relied on exploitation and redistribution of food in favor of its own war economy, this did not appear to be a responsibility, but an undesirable burden. In this way, military expediency and ideological contempt for humanity were combined. This connection was decisive. If it had only been a military consideration, one could perhaps have spoken of a hard but classic blockade. But Leningrad was about more. The German leadership formulated and accepted ideas according to which the city should disappear. Their population was not to be fed. Refugee movements from the city should not simply be treated as a humanitarian problem. People were to remain in the enclosed room until hunger, cold, disease, and shelling had their effect. This created a form of violence that was outwardly less visible than a massacre, but was monstrous in its effect. Death did not always come with gunshots. It came as an empty bread distribution, as a frozen water pipe, as a dwindling strength in the legs, as a silent extinction in an unheated apartment. For the Wehrmacht, this decision meant that it became part of a war of annihilation, even where it did not murder directly. Artillery, airstrikes, blockade positions, cutting off transport routes, and preventing sufficient supplies were not neutral acts. They had a direct effect on the civilian population. The idea that the military leadership merely carried out orders or pursued purely operational goals falls short in the case of Leningrad. The siege shows how much military strategy and political ideology merged in the German war against the Soviet Union. Anyone who encloses a city of millions and deliberately refuses to provide it with care decides on the lives of its inhabitants. In Leningrad itself, the full character of this decision was not fully known at first. People knew they were trapped. They felt that food was becoming scarcer. They heard the bombs, saw the fires, stood in lines and watched the rations drop. But few could have known how cold-bloodedly their fate was thought of on the other side. For many, hunger was initially a consequence of the war, a terrible hardship that could perhaps be overcome through relief, organization, or perseverance. The fact that the enemy deliberately regarded their hunger as a means made the situation even more cruel, because it meant that no pity, no negotiation, and no human consideration were to be expected. The Soviet leadership reacted to the danger with a mixture of mobilization, toughness and propaganda. Leningrad was not allowed to fall. This demand became a moral and political guideline. The defense of the city was presented as a duty to the fatherland, the revolution, and the fallen. Perseverance slogans, newspaper articles, speeches, and posters were intended to create resilience. But behind this language lay a bitter reality. The city could only be held if soldiers fought at the front, workers remained in the factories, and the population endured the conditions of the blockade. The Soviet side also demanded enormous sacrifices from the people. It did this to prevent annihilation by the enemy, but at the same time it acted within a system that often subordinated individual suffering to the reason of state. The decision on Germany's starvation policy was therefore met with a Soviet decision to persevere at all costs. Between these two forces stood the inhabitants of the city. They were starved from the outside and obliged to endure from within. This double reality is important if one wants to understand the siege of Leningrad. The population was not simply a passive victim, but it was not free either. Many people showed real bravery, solidarity, and willingness to make sacrifices. Others acted out of fear, out of duty, out of habit, or because they had no alternative. Some were morally broken by circumstances. Some shared their last piece of bread. Some stole, cheated, or used relationships to survive. Hunger does not automatically make people noble or cruel. He exposed how fragile morality can be when the body dies. The food supply now became the core of the siege. Bread was the most important symbol, but also the most important instrument of administration. Rations were calculated, reduced, redistributed, differentiated according to work performance and social function. Those who were indispensable for war production received more. Those who were considered addicted received less. This logic could seem expedient from the point of view of the city leadership, because workers in armaments factories had to remain able to work. But it also meant that children, the elderly, and the sick were particularly vulnerable. Hunger created a hierarchy of survival. Not every death was planned directly, but the system decided who got better chances. At the same time, the shelling exacerbated the situation. German artillery and airstrikes not only targeted military installations, but also hit residential areas, camps, transport routes, and supply facilities. Every destroyed warehouse, every damaged pipeline, every interrupted road worsened living conditions. The city lost people not only to bombs and grenades, but also to the consequences of destroyed infrastructure. When water pipes failed, people had to fetch water from canals or the Neva in the freezing cold. If there was a lack of heating material, furniture was burned. When electricity failed, apartments sank into darkness. The blockade was therefore not a single event, but a web of scarcity, violence, and organizational collapse. The coldness of bureaucratic violence was particularly evident in German thinking about Leningrad. The death of a city was presented not only in angry speeches, but in orders, calculations, responsibilities, and strategic considerations. This is precisely what makes such decisions so frightening historically. Cruelty does not always appear as an outbreak of uncontrolled brutality. Sometimes it appears as a file note, as a briefing, as a supply calculation, as military expediency. The inhabitants of Leningrad were not families, names, faces to their enemies. They were a crowd that should not be fed. But Leningrad did not react to this planned annihilation with immediate collapse. The city suffered, but it held. This fact must not be romanticized, because perseverance cost countless lives. But it shows that the German plan did not simply meet with a will-less mass. Soldiers defended the front lines. Workers went to factories even though their bodies were weakening. Doctors treated the wounded and starving under conditions that made any normal medicine impossible. Administrative employees organized rations, often with insufficient resources. Neighbors helped each other as long as they could. Families developed small rituals of survival, shared breadcrumbs, melted snow, dismantled furniture, saved energy. Life became smaller, but it did not disappear. This is precisely the tragedy of this chapter. The decision to starve made Leningrad a place where survival itself became resistance. Not everyone could fight, not everyone could work, not everyone could perform heroic deeds. But those who got up in the morning, those who fetched water, those who cared for a child, those who operated a machine, those who held a position, those who kept a diary, contradicted in their own way the intention to wipe out the city. This form of resistance was quieter than an offensive and less visible than a battle, but it was deeply human. The siege of Leningrad was therefore not determined solely by tanks and front lines. It was shaped by a decision that turned hunger into a method. This decision revealed the character of the German war in the East in all its severity. It showed that the war was not only waged against armies, but against societies, cities, and bodies. Leningrad was to die from want. The inhabitants were not to be defeated, but consumed. But the city remained, wounded, freezing, starving, and weaker every day, but not extinguished. What followed was the darkest phase of the siege, the first winter, in which the decision to starve was to have its cruelest effect. Chapter 7: The First Winter. The first winter of the siege became the darkest test for Leningrad that a modern city had to experience in World War II. The situation had already been threatening in the autumn of 1941. Supplies dwindled, rations dropped, bombing destroyed camps, homes, and supply routes, and people began to realize that confinement would not end after a few days or weeks. But it was not until winter that the siege turned into an almost unimaginable catastrophe. Cold, hunger, darkness, and exhaustion intertwined. What had previously been everyday life under wartime conditions now became a daily struggle for bare survival. The winter of 1941 to 1942 came hard and early. Temperatures fell low, often well below freezing. In a city that received hardly any fuel, this meant not only inconvenience, but danger of death. Heating systems failed, apartments became ice caves, water pipes froze, electricity became scarce or disappeared completely. People slept in coats, hats, gloves, and shoes, sometimes several family members close together to preserve some body heat. Furniture, bookshelves, doors, picture frames, and everything that could burn was gradually burned. The bourgeois or private space, which had previously meant protection and remembrance, disintegrated piece by piece into fuel. The home remained an apartment on the outside, but on the inside it became a survival camp. Even more cruel than the cold was the hunger. The bread rations were reduced further and further. The lowest ration became particularly notorious in November and December 1941, when many people who were not working hard received only tiny amounts of bread. This bread was often no longer a real bread, but a dark, heavy mixture to which substitutes were added. Sawdust, bran, cellulose, and other additives made it possible to spend anything at all, but it could hardly nourish. For the people, every gram of bread became a matter of life or death. It was carefully cut, divided into tiny pieces, placed on the tongue to feel the taste longer, or eaten immediately for fear of being stolen. Bread was no longer a side dish or meal. Bread was time. A piece of bread might mean another morning. The hunger changed the body slowly and mercilessly. People lost weight, their faces became narrow, their eyes were set low, their movements became slow. Stairs that used to be climbed without thinking became almost insurmountable obstacles. The way to the bread distribution could be deadly, not only because of shelling or cold, but because there was no strength to get back. Some people collapsed on the street and did not get up again. Others were in apartments, too weak to call for help. The body began to consume itself. Muscles dwindled, thoughts became sluggish, feelings dulled. Hunger was not only pain in the stomach. He was a power that changed the whole person, his perception, his morality, his language, and his relationship with others. During this time, water became another struggle. Since pipes failed and pumps no longer worked, many residents had to fetch water from the Neva, from canals, or from broken ice spots. People stood in the cold with buckets and cans, often for hours, while their strength was barely sufficient. Then they had to carry the water home over icy roads and dark stairs. A spilled bucket was a small disaster. Firewood, ration cards, and warm clothing also became vital. The simplest activities, which received little attention in peacetime, now devoured whole days. Life no longer meant planning, working, sleeping, and eating. Life meant somehow finding water, somehow getting bread, somehow not freezing to death. The city itself changed its face. Trams were at a standstill because there was no electricity and tracks were blocked. Cars were rare, horses starved to death or were slaughtered, and many journeys were made on foot. Snow-covered streets, ruins, and corpses. It happened that dead people lay in apartments for days because relatives were too weak to take them away, or because there was no one left to take care of them. Sometimes the deceased were placed on sleds and pulled to collection points. These images burned themselves deeply into the memory of the survivors, people who were dragging their dead relatives through the frozen city with the last of their strength, not firewood or food. Death became commonplace, but it didn't make it any less terrible. It only lost its exception, not its importance. Families were also changed by hunger and cold. In normal times, family is a place of closeness, care, and warmth. In Leningrad she often remained so, but at the same time she was harassed by cruel decisions. Who gets the last piece of bread? The child, the working mother, the sick father, the grandmother? Should you eat a ration immediately or split it up? Should you carry or hide a food ration card? When a relative died, in addition to grief, there was sometimes the terrible thought that another ration would be lost or that a card would be preserved as long as the death was not reported. Such situations do not show that people have become inhumane. They show how extreme the conditions were under which normal moral certainties were shattered. Nevertheless, there was not only decay this winter. There was also help, solidarity, and a form of quiet heroism. Neighbors shared hot water, helped with transport, took care of children, brought a piece of bread to exhausted people, or reported to work even though they could hardly stand. Doctors, nurses, and paramedics tried to treat people despite the lack of medicines, heat, and food. In hospitals, the starving and the wounded lay side by side, while the staff themselves starved. Teachers tried to look after children somehow. Workers appeared in factories, sometimes so weak that they had to hold on to machines. Soldiers at the front defended the city while their own families suffered behind them. Leningrad this winter was not only a city of victims, but also a city of countless small efforts, without which it would have collapsed completely. The Soviet leadership tried to maintain order. Food ration cards were checked, businesses were organized, evacuations prepared, transports across Lake Ladoga were intensified. At the same time, the state remained firm. Work duties, discipline, censorship, and propaganda did not disappear. People were supposed to believe that perseverance was possible, and in a way that faith was necessary. But the official words could not hide the reality. Everyone saw the emaciated bodies, the empty streets, the unheated apartments, the long queues, the dead. The propaganda spoke of steadfastness, and many people were actually steadfast. But their steadfastness did not consist of grand speeches. It consisted of footsteps through snow, of trembling hands, of getting up despite weakness, of trying not to give up. During this time, the connection across Lake Ladoga gained special importance. When the lake froze over, the so-called Road of Life was created. Trucks drove over the ice, brought food into the city, and transported people out. This path was dangerous. The ice could break, German planes attacked, vehicles broke down, drivers risked their lives. But despite all the losses, this ice road became a symbol of hope. It could not end the hunger immediately, but it prevented Leningrad from completely suffocating. Every load of flour, every barrel of fuel, every evacuation meant an opportunity. For many people, Lake Ladoga became a thin line between life and death. At the same time, the first winter showed the full brutality of the German starvation policy. The city did not suffer by chance. She suffered because she had been cut off and because her care was deliberately to be prevented. Hunger and cold were not only forces of nature, but consequences of military and political decisions. This realization is important because it takes away any idea of tragic inevitability from what is happening. People did not die simply because it was winter. They died because a large city was encircled, shelled, and cut off from food. As winter slowly drew to a close, Leningrad was badly wounded. Countless people had died. Others were physically and mentally broken. The city had become quieter, darker, emptier. But it still existed. The front held, the administration continued to work, factories produced at least partially, the connection across Lake Ladoga remained, and many people had survived against all odds. This survival was not a triumphant victory, but an exhausted breathing. Leningrad had not defeated the first winter. It had suffered it. But this suffering, this non-disappearance, was already a contradiction to the plan of his enemies. The first winter of the siege was therefore the deepest descent into the reality of the hunger war. He made visible what it means when a city is turned into a weapon against its own inhabitants. Streets, apartments, factories, and squares were threatened not only by bombs, but by shortages. The enemy was not only in front of the city. It could be felt in every empty plate, in every frozen pipe, in every dark stairwell. And yet Leningrad lived on, not out of strength in a simple sense, but out of a mixture of coercion, hope, habit, fear, duty, and human bond. This is precisely the staggering greatness and tragedy of this winter. The city was brought to the brink of death, but it did not give up its life without a fight. Chapter 8: Everyday Life in Hunger. Everyday life in besieged Leningrad was not determined by major events, but by small, recurring struggles. It was not only the bombs, the artillery, and the frontline messages that shaped people's lives. It was the way to the bread distribution, waiting in the cold, counting the rations, searching for water, collecting fuel, the silence in dark apartments, and the constant question of whether the strength would be enough for another day. Hunger turned ordinary life into a series of difficult decisions. Things that used to be taken for granted became tasks that demanded the whole body. Getting up, getting dressed, going down a flight of stairs, standing in line, carrying a bucket of water, or finding a piece of wood, all this could become a test in Leningrad. The hunger was not simply a feeling that came and went. It became a permanent reality. He was there in the morning before you opened your eyes, and he stayed until night. It was in the bones, in the head, in the voice, in the movements. People spoke more slowly, walked more slowly, thought more slowly. Many later reported that their perception narrowed. The thought of food took up more and more space. People dreamed of bread, soup, potatoes, milk, meat, butter, things that had once been normal and now seemed almost unreal. Conversations revolved around rations, ration cards, exchange opportunities, rumors about deliveries, or the question of whether there was still something edible to be found somewhere. Hunger made the world smaller. For many people, a large city full of museums, factories, and streets became a circle of apartment, bread distribution, water point, and perhaps workplace. Bread in particular became the center of life. Those who received a ration treated it with an attention that would hardly have been imaginable in peacetime. Some divided the piece into several small portions to get through the day. Others ate everything immediately because they could not bear the agony of waiting or were afraid that it could be stolen. The bread was often heavy, dark, and moist, stretched with substitutes that had little nutritional value. Nevertheless, it was more precious than almost anything else. A falling crumb was picked up. A knife stroke had to be precise. In many families, the sharing of bread became a tense ritual, because any inaccuracy could trigger suspicion. Those who cut bore responsibility. Anyone who got a slightly larger piece could feel guilty. Those who got a smaller one could feel despair. Hunger penetrated even the most intimate relationships. Food ration cards were almost as important as the food itself. They decided whether a person was entitled to bread. Losing a card could be fatal. Therefore, cards were hidden, guarded, worn on the body, or sewn into clothing. At the same time, temptations and crimes arose. There was theft, fraud, counterfeiting, and a black market where food was exchanged at outrageous prices. Jewelry, clothing, books, family heirlooms, and personal memorabilia could disappear in exchange for a little flour, fat, or bread. Some people took advantage of the plight of others. Others acted out of desperation. The siege not only produced solidarity, but also harshness. Hunger turned moral questions into questions of survival. Those who almost died themselves could hardly remain generous. And yet there were always people who shared, even though they hardly had enough themselves. The search for food led to ever more extreme means. People cooked leather belts, wallpaper paste, carpenter's glue, or other materials that were hoped could give the body some strength. Pets disappeared from the cityscape. Birds, cats, and dogs were eaten if they were still found. In gardens, courtyards, and among ruins, people searched for everything that seemed edible. These actions must not be judged by ordinary standards. They do not show greed, but desperation. When the body begins to consume itself, when children cry and old people can no longer stand up, boundaries change. What would have been unthinkable in the past suddenly appears as the last chance to reach the next day. Water was a second silent front of everyday life. When pipes failed and pumps stopped, many residents had to fetch water from the Neva, from canals, or from ice holes. In winter, this meant a dangerous path through snow, cold, and darkness. People carried buckets, jugs, or pots, often with trembling hands and weak legs. The way back was especially difficult, because water is heavy, and a starved body had hardly any strength. Stairwells were dark and icy. Anyone who slipped could injure themselves, and perhaps found no one who could help. Nevertheless, water had to be fetched, because without water you couldn't drink, cook, or even prepare the few substitute foods. Every bucket was a victory over exhaustion. Warmth also became a luxury. In many apartments there were small stoves in which what could still burn was burned. Pieces of furniture were dismantled, books burned, floors torn up, doors hung out. For many people, this was not only a practical loss, but a spiritual one. A table where a family had eaten, a chair on which a father was sitting, a shelf full of books, all this became fuel. The apartment lost its past in order to give warmth for a few hours. But even this heat was limited. Often people sat close to a small stove while the rest of the room remained ice cold. Windows were broken or poorly sealed. Breath became visible. Water froze in vessels. Clothes were worn day and night because undressing was too cold. The hunger also changed the time. In peace, a day is structured by work, meals, conversations, journeys, and sleep. In Leningrad, time was determined by rations, queues, and exhaustion. They were waiting for bread. People were waiting for water. They were waiting for news. People were waiting for the next shelling or for it to end. They waited for relief, for evacuation, for an improvement in the situation. At the same time, every day became long and short at the same time. Long, because every hour of hunger was hard. In short, because there was hardly enough strength to do more than the bare minimum. Many people kept diaries, not out of literary ambition, but to record that they still existed. Such records often show a harrowing mixture of sobriety and pain. They tell of rations, deaths, cold, work, small hopes, and the fear that soon there might be no one left to continue writing. For many, the workplace remained a central part of life, even when the body was barely able to work. Factories continued to produce because the city needed weapons, ammunition, and equipment. Workers appeared at the machines with sunken faces and swollen legs. Some were only able to work for a short time, had to sit down, or collapsed. Nevertheless, for some, work was also a form of support. Those who worked sometimes had better rations. Those who were needed may have felt less at the mercy of others. But this stop was bought at a high price. The state demanded performance from people who were fighting for survival themselves. The boundary between duty and excessive demands was hardly recognizable. Children experienced hunger differently, and yet just as cruelly. Many did not fully understand why there was no food, why adults became so quiet, why schools were closed or only open to a limited extent, why neighbors disappeared, and why mother or father suddenly could no longer get up. Some children grew up early. They stood in queues, fetched water, took care of siblings, or guarded food ration cards. Others became apathetic, too weak to play, too tired to ask. The siege robbed them not only of food, but of childhood. Individual images often remained in her memories. A piece of bread on a table, a dark kitchen, a dead relative, a long way through snow, a voice that urged them to persevere. Social relationships also changed. Neighbors could become lifesavers, but also strangers who protected their own last supplies behind closed doors. In communal apartments, where several families shared the kitchen and hallway, hunger exacerbated tensions. Smells, sounds, the rustling of paper, the cutting of bread, everything could arouse suspicion. At the same time, small communities of survival emerged. People looked after each other, shared messages, helped carry water or bury the dead. In a city where state aid often came too late or was not enough, human closeness could be decisive. But she also had limits. If everyone was weak, no one could remain strong for others in the long term. Death became part of everyday life, and that was precisely what made it so unbearable. Not every death was accompanied by explosions. Many died quietly, in beds, on chairs, in stairwells, on the way to the bread distribution. Relatives often did not have the strength to report the deceased immediately or to take them away. Sometimes families lived next to the dead for days, not out of insensitivity, but out of exhaustion. The city administration tried to remove corpses and create mass graves, but the number of dead overwhelmed any order. For the survivors, a protective layer of soul was created. Those who saw death every day had to become inwardly numb in order to be able to move on. But this numbness was not a lack of humanity. It was a survival reaction. Despite everything, culture did not disappear completely. People read when they still had light and strength. Some listened to the radio. Some talked about poems, music, or memories of better times. Not because culture defeated hunger, but because it helped to remain human. In a world that reduced the body to its functions, a poem, a melody, or a diary entry reminded us that man is more than his empty stomach. This is precisely why the preservation of cultural forms in Leningrad was so important. It was not an ornament of history, but a quiet resistance to the transformation of the city into a place of mere death. Everyday life and hunger was therefore an experience that eludes simple concepts. It consisted of suffering, fear, weakness, and death, but also of habit, discipline, love, stubbornness, and small gestures of help. The people of Leningrad did not become heroes because they were not afraid. They were afraid. They did not become strong because they did not suffer. They suffered unimaginably. What makes their experience so harrowing is precisely that they were ordinary people who were forced into an extraordinary disaster. They had to make decisions for which no human being is made. They had to live, even though life had shrunk to a minimum. So hunger became the real ruler of the city. He determined paths, conversations, relationships, work, sleep, and morality. He made bread a sanctuary, water a burden, warmth a miracle, and every morning a question. Leningrad continued to be a city with streets, houses, factories, and squares. But under the siege, it became above all a space of scarcity. And yet, in this lack, something remained that could not be completely destroyed. As long as people shared their bread, kept a diary, protected children, cared for the sick, or simply moved on, the city remained more than a victim of the blockade. It remained a living, suffering, resisting organism. Everyday life and hunger showed how low people can fall when almost everything is taken from them. But he also showed that even in a world of cold and empty bread bags, traces of humanity can survive. Chapter 9: Children, Women, and the Elderly in Besieged Leningrad. The siege of Leningrad was a military catastrophe, a political tragedy, and a human state of emergency. But their deepest cruelty may only become visible when one looks not at front lines, command staffs, or strategic maps, but at those people who had the least influence on the course of events. children, women, and the elderly. They were not marginal figures of the siege, but stood at the center of suffering. Their bodies were weaker, their possibilities more limited, their dependence greater. And yet they were not just passive victims. Many of them contributed to the survival of the city, did work, kept families together, cared for others, and in the midst of hunger and cold, preserved a form of humanity that is so harrowing precisely because it was created under almost inhumane conditions. For children, the siege was a destruction of the world before they could even properly understand this world. A child does not experience war first and foremost as a geopolitical event, but as a change in everyday life. Suddenly, adults are quiet or irritable. Suddenly, there is no real food anymore. Suddenly, fathers disappear to the front or to the factories. Mothers stand in queues for hours. Schools close or function only to a limited extent. Sirens wail, windows are darkened, and one's own hunger becomes stronger than any game. Many children in Leningrad were thrust into a reality in which the usual boundaries between childhood and adulthood collapsed. They had to fetch water, take care of younger siblings, guard ration cards, stand in queues or watch dying relatives. The childlike feeling of being protected by adults was replaced by a bitter experience. The adults were also powerless. It was particularly cruel that many children could not put hunger into words. They felt it as pain, tiredness, cold, and confusion. The body demanded food, but there was none. Some children kept asking for bread until they became too weak to ask. Others became quiet, lay on beds or in dark rooms and hardly moved. Hunger robbed them not only of weight, but also of voice, curiosity, and movement. In the memories of survivors, images of children who no longer played, who stood in coats that were too big, with thin faces, serious eyes, and a maturity that was not maturity, but exhaustion, appear again and again. The siege turned children into small adults, not through experience and education, but through hardship. The evacuation of children was one of the most difficult and tragic chapters of the besieged city. Even before and during the encirclement, children were taken from Leningrad, but the measures were incomplete, chaotic, and often dangerous. Some transports were bombed. Some led to areas that were later threatened by German troops themselves. Many families were separated without knowing if they would ever see each other again. Parents were faced with decisions that were almost unbearable. Should they send their child away, perhaps to relative safety, but without the protection of the family? Or should they keep it to themselves and expose it to danger together? In normal times, such a decision would be impossible. In Leningrad, it became a reality. Any choice could be wrong, and no one could know the future. Women in the besieged city bore a double and often triple burden. Many men were at the front, in military units, in defense, or had already been killed. Women had to provide for families, protect children, care for elderly relatives, and work at the same time. They were in factories, hospitals, administrations, air defense, transportation, medical services, and defense construction. Soviet propaganda liked to show women as determined workers and defenders of the homeland, and in fact they achieved enormous things. But behind the heroic image was an everyday life of exhaustion. A woman could try to get a bread ration in the morning, then fetch water, then go to work, then return home to care for a sick child or an elderly mother, and have hardly any strength left herself. The role of the mother under these conditions became an almost unbearable moral test. In many families, mothers were the ones who shared the bread. They had to decide who got how much, and that decision could make the difference between life and death. They often gave more to their children and less to themselves. Many slowly starved to death while trying to save their children. Others had to experience that even the sacrifice was not enough. The idea of not being able to feed a child is one of the deepest forms of human powerlessness. In Leningrad, it was commonplace. A mother could love, hope, plead, work, and renounce, and yet the plate remained empty. This experience destroyed not only bodies, but also souls. At the same time, women were not only those who provided for them, but also actors in the resistance. They worked in armaments factories, assembled parts, repaired equipment, sewed uniforms, drove vehicles, cared for the wounded, extinguished fires after air raids, and helped rescue buried victims. Many were active in air raid protection or supported the defense of the city in other ways. In the process, the boundaries between the civilian and military spheres became blurred. A worker in a factory was not a soldier in the classical sense, but her work was part of the struggle. A nurse in the icy hospital did not carry a gun, but without her work, even more people would have died. A woman who brought a child through hunger and cold defended life itself in her own way. The old people of Leningrad were among the most vulnerable. Many were physically too weak to cover long distances to bread distributions or water points. They could no longer work and therefore often received lower rations. Those who lived alone were particularly at risk. If neighbors did not help or relatives were missing, an old person could die in an apartment without anyone noticing it immediately. The cold hit her particularly hard. Stairs, ice, darkness, and the search for fuel were almost insurmountable for the elderly. Some had already experienced revolution, civil war, years of hunger, and Stalinist violence. Now, at the end of their lives, they had to endure a new catastrophe that seemed to surpass everything before. But even old people were not only helpless victims. Many preserved memories, gave children support, told of earlier times, or held families together inwardly. In a city where the present was almost unbearable, memory could be a form of resistance. Those who talked about the past reminded us that there had once been another life and perhaps could exist again. Ancient people preserved traditions, prayers, songs, family stories, and simple rituals. A quiet conversation, a fairy tale, a memory of a summer before the war could mean more to a child than a political speech. They gave suffering a framework that went beyond hunger. The coexistence of the generations was severely tested under the siege. In many apartments, children, mothers, grandparents, and other relatives lived close together. This proximity could provide protection, but also exacerbate conflicts. Hunger makes people vulnerable. A noise in the kitchen, a missing crumb, an unevenly divided portion, a lost ration card could trigger mistrust and arguments. At the same time, families were often the last community of protection. Those who were alone died more easily. If you had someone to bring water, pick up a ration, heat the stove, or simply sit next to you, you had better chances. The siege showed how vital bonds can be, but also how heavily they are strained under extreme hardship. It is particularly shocking that many children observed the adult world and registered its collapse. They saw mothers crying, grandfathers not getting up, neighbors disappearing, people lying on the street. They learned early on what death means, not as an abstract idea, but as a daily present. Some children kept a diary or later recalled rations, cold and dying with sober accuracy. This childlike sobriety is often harder to bear than dramatic language. When a child records who in the family died, when bread became scarcer, or how quiet a home had become, then this speaks a truth that needs no embellishment. The Soviet leadership tried to involve children, women, and the elderly in a narrative of perseverance. Women were portrayed as heroines of work, children as young patriots, old people as witnesses of historical steadfastness. Such images could be encouraging, but they also concealed a lot. They rarely showed the mother losing her last strength. They rarely showed the child who was too weak to cry. They rarely showed the old person who died alone in an unheated room. The politics of remembrance tends to transform suffering into meaning. But the actual suffering of the siege was often senseless, dirty, silent, and lonely. Precisely for this reason, one must see both, the real courage and the real despair. In the hospitals, orphanages, and evacuation centers, this reality was particularly visible. Children without parents, old people without relatives, women with exhausted bodies and wounded from the front met each other. The medical staff worked under conditions that hardly allowed for any help. Starvation diseases, frostbite, infections, and injuries came together. There was a lack of medicine, a lack of heating fuel, a lack of food. Care often did not mean healing, but accompaniment. A nurse was able to cover someone warmer, even though there were hardly any blankets. She could give a child some water. She could hold the hand of a dying man. In a world of scarcity, such small gestures became tremendously significant. Looking at children, women, and old people changes the understanding of the siege. It shows that Leningrad was not just a military front, but a city of bodies, relationships, and dependencies. The German starvation policy hit particularly hard those who could fight the least. The Soviet defense demanded sacrifices from those who had hardly any reserves anyway. Between these forces, people tried to preserve life. A mother who shared bread. A child fetching water. A grandmother who told a fairy tale. A worker who went to her shift despite weakness. A nurse who cared for the wounded. An old man who gave his ration to a neighbor's child. Such scenes are no less historical than orders and offensives. They are the core of what siege means. In the end, there is the realization that the most vulnerable not only suffered the most, but also bore much of what kept Leningrad alive. Children embodied the future that could not be extinguished. Women held families, work and care together. Old people retained memory and dignity, even when their strength dwindled. The siege deprived them of safety, food, warmth, and often their lives. But it did not take away all of its importance. It is precisely in their suffering that it becomes apparent that Leningrad was not only a strategic position, but a human city. A city where history was written not only by generals, but by mothers, children, and the elderly who lived on in the shadow of hunger as long as they could. Chapter 10: Culture Against Death. In a city where bread became precious, warmth became luxury, and every new morning became a test, one might have expected culture to fall silent. What were music, books, theater, poetry, or museums supposed to mean when people collapsed on the streets, when homes cooled down, when children starved and families dragged their dead through the snow with the last of their strength? But it was precisely in Leningrad that it became clear that culture in an extreme situation is not just an ornament of life. It can become a form of resistance. Not because it satisfies hunger or stops grenades, but because it gives man back an inner form when everything outside disintegrates. In the besieged city, culture became a sign that Leningrad not only wanted to survive, but refused to be reduced to mere dying. Before the war, Leningrad had been one of the great cultural cities of Europe. The Hermitage, theaters, libraries, conservatories, universities, archives, and museums shaped its self-image. The city lived not only from factories and barracks, but from memory, art, and education. This cultural depth did not simply disappear with the siege. It was threatened, damaged, emaciated, but not wiped out. Art treasures were packed, stored, or protected in cellars. Museum staff guarded empty halls in which pictures had been taken from the walls, as if they were guarding not only objects, but the memory of an entire civilization. Some guided tours of museums even took place in front of empty frames. This sounds almost absurd at first, but it had a deep meaning. The pictures were gone, but her memory remained. The city was saying, "We still know who we are." This attitude was not a matter of course. Hunger narrows the view. Those who are hungry first think of food, of strength, of the next way to the distribution point. The body demands its right, and this right is inexorable. But the human being is not only made up of bodies. Many Leningrad residents clung to books, music, conversations, and memories because they helped them not to completely succumb to hunger. A poem could lead out of the present for 1 minute. One song could remind us of a time when voices did not tremble from freezing. A book could open up a world in which not every set was about rations, death, and shelling. Such moments were small, but they were not unimportant. They gave life a second level, one that the enemy could not simply block. Libraries also remained important in the besieged city. People borrowed books even though they had little strength to carry them home. Some read in dim light, wrapped in coats, their hands stiff from the cold. Others could not read for long, but only the possession of a book, its proximity, its smell, its familiar form could give comfort. However, Books were also burned when there was nothing left to heat a stove. There was a tragic tension in this. Culture could be salvation for the soul, but paper could also mean warmth for the body. Anyone who burned a book did not necessarily do so out of indifference. Maybe he burned something he loved to protect a child from freezing to death for an hour. In Leningrad, even such decisions were marked by hunger. Theater and music had a special role. Performances could not simply go on as if nothing had happened. Actors starved, musicians died, stages were cold, spectators exhausted. And yet events took place. They were sometimes poorly heated, sparsely visited or interrupted by alarms, but they existed. For the Soviet leadership, such events were a propaganda sign. They were supposed to prove that the city was alive and that the enemy could not break its spirit. But it would be too easy to see it as just propaganda. For many people, performances were a real spiritual refuge. Anyone who sat in a theater, albeit freezing and exhausted, took part in a common world again for a short time. You were not just a single starving body, but part of an audience, part of a city, part of a story. The most famous cultural event of the siege was the performance of Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony in August 1942, which Shostakovich had begun work on in Leningrad before being evacuated from the city. The symphony was later closely linked to the fate of Leningrad, even if its musical significance went beyond the actual siege. For the city, it became a sound image of resistance. The performance in Besieged Leningrad was much more than a concert. It was an organizational, physical, and moral effort. Many musicians of the radio orchestra were dead, at the front or too weak to play. Survivors were sought, recalled, collected. Some first had to be stabilized with additional rations so that they could hold an instrument at all. Even the preparation was a fight against the state of the city. The conductor Karl Eliasberg conducted this performance, and his role was later rightly associated with the memory of that day. The musicians were not heroes in the smooth, simple sense. They were starving people who tried to make a huge score sound. Wind players had to find breath even though their bodies were exhausted. String players had to raise their arms, although every movement cost strength. Rehearsals were difficult, sometimes agonizing. But that is precisely why the performance became so important. It not only showed that music was possible, it showed that a city that was to be silenced still had a voice. On the day of the performance, the symphony was not only played in the concert hall. It was transmitted via loudspeakers, also in the direction of the German lines. This had enormous symbolic power. The message was clear: Leningrad is alive. You can shoot at us, you can starve us, you can destroy our streets, but you have not silenced us. For Soviet propaganda, this moment was a gift. But his effect went deeper than propaganda. For many residents, the music was proof that their city still had a common heartbeat. At a time when everyday life isolated people from each other because everyone struggled with their own weakness, the symphony created a collective experience. You didn't just hear sounds. You could hear your own city. Culture in Leningrad, however, was not only the great symphony. It also lived in diaries, letters, wall newspapers, small readings, school lessons, memories, and conversations. Diaries are especially important because they preserve a different truth than official reports. In them, the siege does not appear as a heroic narrative, but as a daily reality. People noted rations, deaths, rumors, weather, bombings, small hopes, and moments of despair. Some entries are shockingly scarce, almost dry. It is precisely this sobriety that makes her so strong. If someone only records who died, how much bread was given out, or that the strength is hardly enough, then a picture of the siege emerges that needs no exaggeration. Writing became self-assurance. As long as you wrote, you were still there. Children's drawings, exercise books, and memorabilia are also part of this culture of survival. They show that even children tried to bring the incomprehensible into shape. Sometimes they painted airplanes, bombs, bread, soldiers, or houses. Sometimes they wrote short sentences that tell more than long speeches. Such traces are not art in the classical sense, but they are testimonies. They preserve the gaze of those who did not make political decisions and yet had to bear their consequences. Culture here means not only great works, but every human form of giving expression to what has been experienced. At the same time, culture in Leningrad must not be glorified. It was not equally accessible to everyone. Those who were too weak to get up could not attend a concert. Anyone who fought for a child in an unheated apartment may not have had the strength for books. Anyone who died before the symphony was heard could no longer experience any sign of resistance. The later stories about cultural steadfastness must not cover up the suffering. There were people who found comfort and people for whom any comfort came too late. There was real cultural self-assertion, but also state staging. There was internal resistance, but also the compulsion to show strength to the outside world. The truth lies in this tension. The Soviet leadership deliberately used culture as a means of mobilization. Artists, writers, and musicians should give courage, interpret victims, and morally charge the defense. That was not unusual in an all-out war. But in Leningrad, this mobilization took on a special gravity because the audience did not consist of people comfortably seated in a safe hinterland. It consisted of starving, mourning, freezing people. When they were told about steadfastness, they knew better than any speaker what steadfastness cost. That is why culture could only have an effect if it did not completely ignore reality. The strongest works and gestures were those that did not deny pain, but gave it form. There was a deep human dignity in this form. The enemy wanted to reduce Leningrad to starvation and capitulation. The city responded not only with weapons, but with memory, music, language, and images. This does not mean that culture was stronger than bread. No poem could feed a starving man. No symphony could bring back a dead mother. No library could repair a frozen water pipe. But culture was able to prevent people from perceiving themselves only as a starving body. She could say, "We are more than victims. We are human beings with names, voices, stories, and memory." This is precisely why culture against death became one of the most impressive motifs of the siege. It was not a way out of the catastrophe, but a way to remain human in it. In a concert hall, in a diary, in a library, in an empty museum hall, in a poem read in dim light, Leningrad asserted a truth that contradicted the logic of starvation. A city doesn't just die when its bodies die. She also dies when her memory, her language, and her inner life are erased. Leningrad lost countless people, immeasurably much strength and a part of his soul. But it did not lose its voice. When the Seventh Symphony sounded, when books continued to be borrowed, when museum staff explained empty frames, when people kept diaries and children learned despite everything, there was no easy triumph. Something more fragile and perhaps more important emerged. The proof that humanity can also leave traces where violence wants to devour everything. Culture did not save Leningrad alone. But it helped the city not only to survive, but not to lose itself completely. In the midst of hunger, cold, and death, it remained a quiet, sometimes weak, but unmistakable contradiction against annihilation. Chapter 11: The Road of Life. When Leningrad was surrounded by land, Lake Ladoga remained the last major connection to the outside world. On maps, this lake initially looked like a geographical detail, a wide expanse of water east of the city, bordered by banks, forests, villages, and narrow traffic routes. But for the trapped people, it became something else entirely. Lake Ladoga became a hope, a danger, a lifeline, and a symbol. It had to be used to bring food into the city, the wounded and children out, fuel in, machines, medicines, ammunition, and messages in both directions. Without this connection, Leningrad would have sunk into hunger and death even faster. With it, the city remained alive, but only with enormous sacrifices. As early as the autumn of 1941, it was clear that the supply of Leningrad via the lake had to be organized. The land routes were interrupted, the railway connections were cut off, the roads were no longer safe. But supplying a city of millions with water while German planes, artillery, and one's own organizational overload threatened, every transport was a huge task. Ports had to be used, ships prepared, cargoes assembled, and routes secured. The quantities that were needed were huge. The quantities that actually arrived were initially far too small. Every sack of flour, every barrel of fuel, and every box of medicines had to be loaded, transported, and unloaded under difficult conditions. There was hardly any border between military necessity and human survival, because everything that reached the city could save lives and at the same time prolong the resistance. Lake Ladoga was not a peaceful escape route. It was part of the war. Storms could endanger boats, poor visibility made orientation difficult, and the Soviet organization was often improvised, especially in the first few months. Many people involved in this supply worked in conditions that were almost as dangerous as the frontline service. Seafarers, dock workers, drivers, soldiers, mechanics, paramedics, and simple helpers had to carry on despite exhaustion, cold, and air raids. The lake was an open space where you couldn't hide. Anyone who was on the road there knew that every trip could be the last. With the winter, the importance of Lake Ladoga changed once again. When the water froze, the famous Street of Life was created. Trucks drove over the ice, a seemingly impossible road that was not made of asphalt, stone, or rails, but of frozen water. This ice road connected besieged Leningrad with the Soviet hinterland. It was an extreme challenge technically, organizationally, and personally. The ice had to be thick enough to carry vehicles. Routes had to be marked, checked, and constantly adjusted. Too heavy loads could cause the ice to break. Movements that are too slow could be dangerous. Cracks, blizzards, darkness, and enemy attacks made every journey a risk. For the drivers, the road of life was a path between courage and fear of death. Many drove at night to be less visible. The headlights often had to be darkened. Engines failed in the cold, tires slipped, vehicles got stuck or sank when the ice gave way. Anyone who fell into the icy water hardly had a chance. Nevertheless, they drove on, again and again, because every load counted. Some drivers were barely older than teenagers, others experienced men, many themselves malnourished, overtired, and freezing. They knew that a city was waiting behind them, where people were standing in front of empty distribution points. This thought gave the journeys a moral heaviness. It wasn't just about transportation. It was about the survival of a city. The road of life brought mainly food to Leningrad. Flour, grain, canned meat, sugar, fat, and other supplies were driven over the ice. But the quantities were far from sufficient to end hunger immediately. The city was too big, the losses too high, the demand too enormous. Nevertheless, care has been gradually improved. Every improvement in the bread ration meant hope. People who had lived on the brink of death for weeks felt, perhaps for the first time, that complete collapse was not inevitable. The road of life did not end the famine in one fell swoop, but it prevented Leningrad from suffocating completely. At the same time, this path led people out of the city. Especially children, the sick, the wounded, and exhausted civilians were evacuated via Lake Ladoga. These evacuations were also dangerous. Anyone who came on a transport was not yet saved. The journey to the assembly point took strength. The weight was hard. The journey over the ice or water was life-threatening. And after arriving in the hinterland, another life of uncertainty began for many. Families were separated. Mothers had to decide whether to send their children away. Children went out without knowing if they would ever see their parents again. Some survived precisely because of this. Others died on the way or later as a result of hunger and disease. Rescue was rarely pure and easy in Leningrad. It was almost always accompanied by pain. For those who stayed in the city, the Street of Life became an inner image. You couldn't always see her, but you knew about her. There were rumors of trucks, of ice cream, of attacks, of food that had arrived. In a city where hope was often dangerous, because every disappointment hit even deeper, this path nevertheless offered a reason to live on. As long as trucks were driving, Leningrad was not completely alone. As long as the lake offered a connection, the the city still had a breath. Maybe tomorrow there would be more flour. Maybe a ration was increased. Maybe there was a way to evacuate. Perhaps the relief came closer. Such thoughts could help people endure another day. Militarily, the road of life was also decisive. Leningrad was not only a starving city, but also a front position of enormous importance. The defenders needed ammunition, spare parts, fuel, and reinforcements. Factories had to continue to work as far as possible. Troops at the front had to be supplied. Without the connection across Lake Ladoga, military defense would have been much more difficult. Thus, the fate of the civilian population was directly linked to the strategic location. A truck could bring flour for children, but also ammunition for guns. In the logic of total war, the two things were connected, because the survival of the city and its military resistance could not be separated. The German side tried to disrupt this connection, but was never able to completely stop it. Attacks on transport routes, ports, and vehicles caused severe damage and cost many lives. But the line remained in operation, albeit under changing conditions. This was an important reason why the plan to break Leningrad through complete isolation did not fully work. The city continued to suffer immeasurably, but it was not completely cut off from the world. Lake Ladoga did not turn the siege into a complete encirclement without any opening, but a deadly blockade with a narrow, dangerous, and always contested entrance. The organization of this lifeline required enormous efforts. Roads to the lake had to be maintained, camps set up, vehicles repaired, drivers assigned, loads planned, and evacuees supplied. Railway connections in the hinterland were also important so that goods could be brought to the lake at all. A supply chain is only as strong as its weakest point. If there was a shortage of flour somewhere, a vehicle broke down, a port was bombed, or ice was damaged, Leningrad felt the consequences. Behind every piece of bread that was handed out in the city, there was therefore a chain of people who worked under the most difficult conditions. The Street of Life later became one of the most powerful symbols of the siege. The name itself carries an almost simple truth. It was a street, and it meant life. But this symbol must not be romanticized. It was not a bright escape route on which the tragedy simply turned. It was a path full of the dead, full of fear, full of sunken vehicles, frozen people, destroyed cargoes, and broken families. This is precisely why its importance is so great. It does not stand for easy rescue, but for rescue under extreme danger. For a connection that was always too weak and yet strong enough to prevent the complete death of the city. In the interior of Leningrad, however, everyday life remained hard. Even when more supplies became possible via Lake Ladoga, hunger, cold, and death did not suddenly stop. The damage of the first winter was deep. Many people were so weakened that even extra food could not save them. Diseases spread, families were destroyed, apartments cooled down, the city exhausted. But the lifeline across the lake gave the city time. And time was one of the most precious commodities in the siege. Time meant the ability to increase rations, continue evacuations, prepare military counterattacks, organize new supply routes, and maintain resistance. The moral significance of this union can hardly be overestimated. The German starvation strategy was based on the idea that isolation would break the city. The Street of Life contradicted this idea practically and symbolically. It showed that Leningrad had not been completely abandoned. It showed that people were willing to drive over ice, under bombs, and through darkness to save others. It also showed that a city is not defined by walls and front lines alone, but by relationships. Leningrad was besieged, but it remained connected. This connection was narrow, dangerous, and inadequate, but it was real. For the survivors, the memory of Lake Ladoga often remained ambivalent. It was the place of hope, but also the place of fear. He saved lives and took lives. He brought bread and devoured vehicles. He separated families and saved children. It was nature, traffic route, front area, and symbol at the same time. Those who were evacuated via it may have remembered the cold, engine noise, darkness, and the fear that the ice might break. Those who stayed in Leningrad may remember the news that transports had arrived again. For drivers and helpers, every mission was a fight against exhaustion, weather, and the enemy. The Street of Life was thus not a side section of the siege, but one of its central locations. She didn't decide the outcome alone, but without her, the outcome would probably have been even more cruel. She combined military logistics with human rescue, state organization with personal courage, hope with danger. It condensed the whole tragedy of Leningrad, a huge city hung on a narrow path over ice and water. Millions of people continued to live because other people were driving, loading, repairing, steering, waiting, and dying. Lake Ladoga thus became more than a geographical border. It became the last open breath of a city that was supposed to suffocate, but did not suffocate. Chapter 12: Military Resistance and Soviet Counterattacks. The siege of Leningrad was not only a story of hunger, cold, and civil suffering. At the same time, it was an ongoing military battle that was fought on the outskirts of the city, in forests, swamps, villages, trenches, and destroyed villages. While the population struggled for bread, water, and warmth in the interior of the city, soldiers stood on the front lines who had to prevent Leningrad from falling for good. This front was not a silent ring that was drawn once and then remained unchanged. It was a living, bloody space of constant attacks, counterattacks, artillery duels, scouting parties, shifts, and failed hopes. The city was starving, but it continued to fight. And this fight was one of the reasons why the plan of their enemies did not fully work. After the encirclement of Leningrad, German troops were stationed in the south and southwest of the city, while Finnish forces in the north further aggravated the situation. The German Army Group North had not achieved its great goal of taking the city quickly, but it had cut off Leningrad to such an extent that the city fell into a deadly crisis. Militarily, this meant a difficult situation for both sides. The Germans had to hold a long siege ring, tie up forces, organize supplies, and at the same time hold their own on other sections of the Eastern Front. The Soviets had to defend an encircled city of millions, supply troops, prepare counterattacks, and prevent the enemy from further improving its positions. Every kilometer of ground could be decisive because it decided on artillery range, roads, railway lines, and supplies. For the Soviet leadership, Leningrad was not just a city, but a symbol that could not be abandoned. His loss would have had a tremendous moral and political impact. The city bore Lenin's name, was a center of revolutionary memory and an important industrial location. Stalin and the military leadership knew that abandoning Leningrad would have an impact far beyond the region. Therefore, enormous forces were used to hold the front and later break through it. But this determination came at a high price. Many Soviet attacks were carried out under the most severe conditions, often with inadequate preparation, inadequate equipment, and huge losses. The will to break through was great, but the way there led through terrain that was almost murderous for attackers. The front around Leningrad was characterized by forests, rivers, swamps, and small villages that turned into fortified positions. Especially the area south and southeast of the city, in the direction of Mga, Schlüsselburg, and the Neva section, became a bloody focal point. This was about the connection between Leningrad and the Soviet hinterland. If it were possible to break through the German corridor to the blockade, the city could be supplied by land again. This is precisely why the German troops defended these areas with great severity. For them, the blockade ring was a means of starving the city and tying up Soviet forces. For the Soviets, every attack on this ring was an attempt to give millions of people a better chance of survival. A particularly tragic example of the severity of these battles was the Neva bridgehead, which became known as Nevsky Pyatakchak. There, Soviet troops tried to gain a foothold on the western bank of the Neva and create a starting point for the breakthrough. The area was small, open, constantly under German fire, and hardly sufficiently supplied. Nevertheless, soldiers were sent there again and again. Many died before they could even reach a stable position. The ground was plowed up by artillery, units were smashed, and the wounded often could not be recovered. From a military point of view, the bridgehead was an attempt to put pressure on the German encirclement ring. From a human point of view, It became a place of mass death, where the determination of the Soviet leadership and the willingness of the soldiers to make sacrifices became terribly visible. The Soviet counterattacks had different goals. Sometimes they were to take immediate pressure off the city, sometimes to tie up German reserves, sometimes to force a breakthrough, sometimes only to prevent the enemy from strengthening his positions. But everyone was under the same problems. In 1941 and 1942, the Red Army was still in a phase of heavy losses and organizational adjustment. The defeats of the first months of the war had caused enormous damage. Many experienced soldiers had been killed or captured. New units had to be hastily set up. Equipment, artillery, communications, and air support were often inadequate. At the same time, the political leadership demanded results. Defeats were not only understood as military failure, but could also be interpreted as a lack of will or betrayal. This atmosphere created pressure, which was reflected in costly attacks at the front. For the soldiers, the battle for Leningrad meant a special psychological burden. Behind them was not a distant city, but a starving metropolis full of civilians. Many had relatives in Leningrad. They knew that every failed attack meant not only militarily that a position was not won, but also that the city continued to starve. This connection between the front and the homeland gave the struggle a deep emotional tension. A soldier could stand in the trenches and at the same time know that his mother, wife, or child might have hardly had any bread a few kilometers away. This did not make the war easier, but harder. The adversary was in front of them, but suffering was behind them. The defenders within the city also played an important role. Despite hunger and shelling, Leningrad remained a military and industrial space. Factories continued to produce as far as conditions permitted. Weapons were repaired, ammunition was produced, equipment was provided. Workers who were themselves malnourished kept machines running. This work was part of the resistance. Without them, the frontline troops would have had even greater difficulties. The defense of Leningrad was therefore based not only on soldiers with rifles, but also on women and men in factory halls, on technicians, railway workers, drivers, nurses, radio operators, cooks, and administrative staff. The military resistance was a network that ran through the entire city. The Germans, on the other hand, were faced with a problem that they themselves had helped to create. They did not want to conquer Leningrad with high losses of their own in street fighting, but to break through blockade. But the blockade required its troops to hold positions for long periods of time, use artillery, repel attacks, and hold their own against Soviet relief attempts. This tied up forces that were lacking in other sections of the front. Leningrad became a permanent military weight for the German side. The city did not fall, but it devoured attention, ammunition, personnel, and planning. The longer the siege lasted, the clearer it became that the German hope for a quick collapse was not fulfilled. Another factor was the development of the entire war in the East. The German attack on Moscow failed in the winter of 1941 at the gates of the Soviet capital. The Wehrmacht had to realize that the Soviet Union would not be defeated in a few months. This change also had an effect on Leningrad. The city remained encircled, but the war became longer, harder, and increasingly difficult for Germany. The Red Army learned from defeats, improved its organization, set up new units, and relocated industry to the hinterland. Leningrad was still in grave danger, but the strategic situation was slowly changing. The question was no longer whether the Soviet Union would collapse immediately. The question was whether she could gather enough strength to blow up the ring one day. In 1942, Soviet forces repeatedly tried to break through the blockade. In particular, the battles in the Lublin area and on the Folkhof showed how difficult this goal was. The Soviet Second Shock Army found itself in a catastrophic situation, was partially encircled, and suffered heavy losses. These operations reveal the tragedy of Soviet relief attempts. They arose from a real military and humanitarian need to save the city, but were often carried out in conditions that left little chance for the attacking troops. Terrain, weather, German defenses, weak supplies, and weak leadership led to many attacks sinking into blood. For Leningrad, Any failure meant that hunger continued. Despite these defeats, Soviet resistance was not in vain. Each attack forced the German side to hold forces and deploy reserves. Every bridgehead, every artillery position, every local success changed the situation a little. Military history consists not only of great victories, but also of pressure, attrition, and preparation. The later successes before Leningrad did not come out of nowhere. They were prepared by months and years of the heaviest fighting, by experiences, losses, new plans, and a gradually stronger Red Army. What seemed desperate and poorly coordinated in 1941 became more systematic over time. In January 1943, a decisive partial success was finally achieved with Operation Iskra. Soviet troops attacked from Leningrad and the Fokhov area and were able to open a narrow land corridor south of Lake Ladoga. This breakthrough ended the city's complete land isolation, even though the siege was not over. The corridor was narrow, endangered, and under German fire, but it allowed the construction of a railway connection and improved supply. For the inhabitants of Leningrad, this success had enormous significance. For the first time in a long time, the city was no longer solely dependent on Lake Ladoga. The ring was not completely smashed, but it was open-worked. This had military, practical, and spiritual value. The fighting did not stop there. German positions continued to threaten the city, artillery fire remained possible, and the final liberation was not to succeed until January 1944. But the breakthrough of 1943 showed that the blockade did not have to last forever. He proved that the Red Army, despite all its losses and mistakes, was capable of coordinated operations. It also showed that the city had not only suffered passively, but was part of a long military struggle that was slowly shifting in favor of the Soviet Union. The military resistance around Leningrad must therefore be viewed in all its ambivalence. It was necessary because without it the city would have fallen or been completely suffocated. It was heroic because countless soldiers, workers, and helpers fought and worked under extreme conditions. But it was also terribly costly, marked by wrong decisions, political pressure, and a way of dealing with human lives that was often merciless. The Soviet defense saved Leningrad, but it cost countless lives. This truth cannot simply be resolved into triumph or accusation. It is part of the tragedy of the siege. For the people in the city, the fighting at the front was often far and near at the same time. They heard guns, saw the wounded, read reports, waited for news. But the exact events often remained unclear. Official reports spoke of successes, of brave soldiers, of heroic resistance. Rumors told otherwise, of failed attacks, high losses, desperate positions. Between propaganda and reality, people had to keep their hope. Every attack could be the longed-for breakthrough. Every disappointment could mean another week of hunger. In the end, Chapter 12 shows that the siege of Leningrad was not only decided inside the city. It was also decided on the front lines, in muddy trenches, on frozen rivers, in destroyed villages, and on narrow bridgeheads. The hunger of the city and the blood of the front belonged together. While civilians counted breadcrumbs, soldiers fought for a few meters of ground. While trucks drove across Lake Ladoga, armies tried to break up the ring. While the German leadership relied on exhaustion and death, the Soviet side slowly gathered the strength to retaliate. Leningrad survived not by a single miracle, but by a long chain of resistance, sacrifice, organization, and suffering. The military struggle was as cruel as it was decisive. Without him, the city might not have continued to live. Through him, however, she paid a price that is hard to measure. Chapter 13: Propaganda, Truth, and Silence. The siege of Leningrad was not only a struggle for roads, front lines, bread rations, and supply routes. It was also a struggle for interpretation. While people starved, froze, died, and yet continued to live, at the same time there was a struggle for words, images, and memories. What could be said? What had to be concealed? What should the population believe? What should the enemy hear? What was to remain of all this later? In a besieged city, truth has never been simply a collection of facts. Truth became dangerous, political, comforting, destructive, or useful, depending on who spoke it and for what purpose. Leningrad was therefore not only the scene of a military and humanitarian catastrophe, but also a place where propaganda, censorship, and personal remembrance intertwined in a painful way. On the German side, the siege was embedded in a language of dehumanization from the beginning. The National Socialist leadership regarded the war against the Soviet Union as a war of annihilation. In this view, Leningrad was not simply a large city with millions of inhabitants, but a symbol of Bolshevism, a place that was to be politically and ideologically extinguished. The language of German propaganda turned people into masses, civilians into opponents, hunger into an alleged necessity. The less the inhabitants of the city were perceived as individual people, the easier it was to justify or ignore their suffering. This was precisely one of the most dangerous functions of propaganda. It not only prepared violence, but also helped to make this violence inwardly bearable for those who practiced or supported it. The German public did not learn the whole truth about the intention to starve Leningrad. As is so often the case in the National Socialist system, crimes were concealed by euphemistic, military, or bureaucratic formulations. There was talk of encirclement, military necessity, frontline position, or the fight against Bolshevism. Children, mothers, the elderly, the sick, workers, and teachers disappeared behind such terms. The real consequence of the blockade, namely the mass starvation of civilians, was not treated as a moral problem. Propaganda made it possible to depopulate a city in the imagination before it actually began to die. If you only see an enemy image, you will no longer hear the crying of a child. On the Soviet side, propaganda had a different function, but it also shaped reality. The leadership had to persuade a trapped, starving, and bombed population to hold out. It had to generate hope, ensure discipline, prevent panic, and maintain the belief in victory. Leningrad was not allowed to appear as a dying city, but had to be shown as a fighting city. Newspapers, radio reports, posters, speeches, and public slogans spoke of bravery, steadfastness, sacrifice, and hatred of the enemy. These messages were not simply empty. Many people actually felt deep anger at the German besiegers. Many wanted to persevere. Many saw the defense of the city as a moral duty. But the official language could only capture part of the reality. She showed the strength, but not always the weakness. She showed heroism, but not always despair. It showed the community, but not always the loneliness. Soviet propaganda needed clear images. The worker at the machine, the mother who protects her child, the soldier in the trenches, the artist who makes music despite hunger, the city that does not surrender. These images were powerful because they were based on real experiences. There were such workers, such mothers, such soldiers, and such musicians. But as soon as such images became the official narrative, they threatened to displace other experiences. What about those who couldn't take it anymore? What about those who stole to survive? What about those who doubted the leadership, who cursed, despaired, collapsed inside, or just wanted to die? They too belonged to the truth of Leningrad. But they did not fit into the public narrative of an unshakable hero city. Censorship was a central instrument in this. In times of war, states always control information particularly strictly, but in Leningrad this control became even more important due to the extreme situation. Panic could be deadly, rumors could destroy order, criticism could be seen as a danger to the defense. Therefore, not everything that happened was published. The number of deaths, the extent of hunger, failures in supplies, chaotic evacuations, thefts, desperation, and social tensions were not openly portrayed in the way people experienced them. The official truth was filtered. It should not lie in the simple sense, but select, shape, and direct. But every selection creates shadows. What is not said does not disappear. It wanders into kitchens, diaries, whispers, memories, and silence. Radio played a special role. In a city where newspapers were harder to circulate and people often sat isolated in cold apartments, voices from loudspeakers became a connection with the outside world. News, perseverance slogans. Music and warnings reached people who might otherwise only hear their own breathing and distant impacts. Radio could provide comfort, but also create a controlled reality. It said that the city was struggling, that aid was on the way, that the enemy would fail. Sometimes people needed exactly these words, even when they knew that the reality was worse. Hope can be vital in a siege, even if it is not entirely true. At the same time, a second truth lived in Leningrad, which was not written on posters. It can be found in diaries, private letters, memoirs, and later reports. This personal truth is often quieter, but more shattering. It does not tell of the heroic collective, but of the individual body. About the fear of losing the food ration card. Of the shame of not being able to do anything more for a child. Of anger at functionaries who seem to be better cared for. Of envy of people with a higher ration. Of the relief when a sick relative died and his suffering ended. Such thoughts are hard to bear, but they are human. Precisely for this reason, they rarely became part of the official memory. They show a siege in which morality did not disappear, but was under pressure that later generations would hardly judge. The silence often began during the siege. Many people did not speak openly about what they felt, not only out of fear of political control, but also out of protection from oneself and others. How could you explain to a child that there might be no more bread? How should you tell a neighbor that you see her need, but you can't give anything? How could one talk about the dead when new ones were added every day? Silence could be cowardice, but also care. It could arise from fear, but also from exhaustion. Those who are hungry often do not have the strength to speak their own truth. After the end of the siege, the struggle for memory continued. The Soviet Union made Leningrad a hero city. This honor was not unfounded. The city had suffered the unimaginable and had not fallen. Their defenders, workers, drivers, doctors, musicians and residents had indeed achieved a historic feat, but the official memory preferred the sublime. She spoke of self-sacrifice, patriotism, and victory. She honored the dead, but she placed her dying in a grand national narrative. As a result, some things became visible and others were hidden. The mistakes of the leadership, the extent of chaotic care, social inequalities, despair, mental breakdowns, and moral gray areas had little place in this narrative. The question of responsibility on the Soviet side was particularly difficult. The main responsibility for the famine lay with the German blockade and the conscious decision to starve. There must be no doubt about that. But within the city there were also decisions, omissions, and hardships that could only be talked about to a limited extent for a long time. Why hadn't more people been evacuated earlier? Why hadn't supplies been better protected or distributed? Why did some companies have to continue working under inhumane conditions? Why were certain groups better cared for than others? Such questions were politically sensitive because they disturbed the image of a uniformly heroic defense. But a mature memory must allow such questions without relativizing the guilt of the besiegers. The number of victims also became part of the politics of remembrance. Numbers can be necessary to understand the extent of a disaster, but they can also hide something. Whether hundreds of thousands or more than 1 million people died, each number stands for individual lives. For a name, a face, an apartment, a family, a body that could no longer bear hunger and cold. Propaganda tends to turn numbers into monuments. Personal memory transforms them back into people. That is why diaries, testimonies, and family histories are so important. They prevent the siege from appearing only as a great historical mass. For a long time, German post-war memory had a hard time with the siege of Leningrad. While other crimes of National Socialism gradually became more and more public, the hunger war against Soviet cities and regions often remained less present. For a long time, the war in the East was portrayed in parts of memory as a military struggle, not sufficiently as a war of annihilation against civilian populations. Leningrad, however, forces us to abandon this separation. The blockade was militarily organized and at the same time a crime against people. It shows how an army became part of a murderous overall strategy through encirclement, shelling, and starvation policy. This late recognition is also part of the truth about the siege. For the survivors, the relationship between memory and silence often remained complicated. Some told again and again because they wanted no one to forget. Others remained silent for decades because words were not enough or because telling the story brought back the old pain. Some adapted their memories to the official language. Others preserved private truths in the family circle. There was pride and trauma, gratitude and bitterness, patriotic certainty and silent doubts. A person can be proud of having survived at the same time and marked by things he cannot talk about. It is precisely this contradiction that makes the memory of Leningrad so human. Propaganda, truth and silence were not separate areas during the siege. They existed at the same time. An official poster could express real courage and at the same time cover up suffering. A radio report could give hope and at the same time gloss over it. A diary could be more honest than a newspaper, but only show a small excerpt. Silence could mean oppression or self-protection. If you want to understand the siege, you have to look at these levels side by side. The truth of Leningrad lies not only in orders, not only in the number of victims, not only in heroic narratives and not only in private memories. It arises from the tension between them. In the end, the question remains as to how one can tell about such a catastrophe without falsifying it. One must not downplay the resistance of the city. Leningrad stood firm, and this standing was historically significant. But one must not dissolve suffering into pathos either. People did not die so that later generations would find beautiful words. They died because a criminal blockade cut them off from food, warmth, and security. They survived if they survived, not as figures in a legend, but as vulnerable people. An honest memory must preserve both, the dignity of resistance and the nakedness of suffering. Leningrad became a hero city, but it was a starving city at first. It became a symbol of victory, but before that it was a place of dying. It has been immortalized in speeches, monuments, and school textbooks, but its deepest truth often lies in the quiet voices of those who weighed bread, carried water, counted the dead, and still continued to breathe. Propaganda wanted to give meaning, truth wanted to make visible, silence wanted to protect or conceal. Between these forces, the image of a siege emerged that continues to shake today. Because if you tell Leningrad only as a heroic story, you lose the people. Anyone who tells it only as a victim story loses their resistance. Only when both come together do you begin to understand what this city has really lived through. Chapter 14: The Breakthrough and the End of the Siege. When the year 1943 began, Leningrad was a city that had already endured more than people can actually bear. The first winter had left deep wounds. Hunger had destroyed families. The cold had turned homes into burial chambers, and yet the city had not fallen. She was weakened, emaciated, and scarred, but she was still alive. For the German leadership, this was a failure of its cruel expectation. Leningrad had not capitulated. The population had not simply collapsed. The Soviet defenders continued to hold their positions. The connection across Lake Ladoga functioned despite all the dangers, and the Red Army slowly gathered the strength for new operations. The question was no longer just how Leningrad could survive, but when it would succeed in breaking the ring. The first major turning point came in January 1943 with Operation Iskra. The name meant spark, and it suited what this offensive meant for the besieged city. It was not yet a complete victory, not yet a final liberation, but it was a spark of hope at a time when many people had learned to treat hope with care. Soviet troops attacked from two directions. From Leningrad, units advanced eastwards, while forces of the Volkhof front pushed westwards from the outside. Their destination was the narrow German blockade strip south of Lake Ladoga, the area that separated the city from the Soviet hinterland. If this strip could be breached, Leningrad would no longer be completely cut off from land. The fighting was fierce. The terrain was difficult, characterized by snow, ice, swamps, forests, and destroyed settlements. German positions were prepared, artillery and machine guns covered the attack routes, and every meter of ground had to be won with heavy losses. The Soviet soldiers knew that behind them was not only a military task, but the fate of a starving city. Many struggled with the awareness that a breakthrough would not only change a line on the map, but would mean bread, medicine, fuel, and perhaps life. Precisely for this reason, the attack was characterized by a particular emotional tension. It was not just about terrain. It was about the first crack in a deadly embrace. AM 18. Januar 1943 Treffen Sowjetische Truppen AUS beiden Richtungen aufeinander. Der Blockadering war an einer Stelle durchbrochen. Der Geöffnete Korridor war schmal. Verwundbar und lag weiterhin unter deutscher Bedrohung. Aber seine Bedeutung war enorm. Zum ersten Mal seit September 1941 bestand wieder ein Landverbindung zur Stadt. Für Leningrad war das ein Moment von ungeheurer moralischer Kraft. Die vollständige Belagerung war noch nicht beendet. Die deutsche Artillerie konnte die Stadt weiterhin beschießen, und der Alltag blieb hart. Doch die psychologische Wirkung war kaum zu überschätzen. Die Stadt war nicht mehr nur über den gefahrlichen Ladagasse mit dem übrigen Land verbunden. Es gab wieder einen Streifen Erde, der Leningrad mit der Sowjetunion verband. Immediately, the construction of a railway line through this corridor began. This connection was later often referred to as the Victory Road. Their construction was dangerous and difficult, because the area was close to German positions and was shelled. Nevertheless, pioneers, railroad workers and workers worked at great speed. Every meter of rail meant an improvement in supply. Trains could transport more than trucks over ice or ships over water. Although the line remained at risk, it changed the situation noticeably. Food, ammunition, fuel, and other goods reached the city more reliably. Rations could be gradually improved, and even if hunger and deprivation did not simply disappear, the worst state of total surrender was broken. For the people of Leningrad, this breakthrough was not just military news. It was a sign that their suffering did not have to be endless. Many residents had learned to approach official reports with caution, because too often they had heard about successes while their everyday lives continued to consist of hunger and death. But this success was more tangible. More goods arrived. The supply improved. The city breathed a little more freely. Nevertheless, one must not glorify this moment. Those who were already severely damaged were not always saved by better rations. Many people were so physically emaciated that they died as a result of the famine. Others had lost relatives, lost homes, destroyed their health. The breakthrough brought hope, but it did not undo what had happened. Leningrad remained militarily threatened even after January 1943. The German troops were still within reach, the front was dangerously close, and the city was still not completely liberated. Artillery shelling remained part of life. Destruction continued. The German leadership did not give up the position voluntarily either. Leningrad continued to tie up forces, and the area south of the city remained an important section of the Eastern Front. But the strategic situation had changed. The Soviet Union was no longer the shaken power of the first months of the war. After the Battle of Moscow, and especially after Stalingrad, the balance of power had slowly shifted. The Red Army grew stronger, learned from mistakes, and was able to plan ever larger operations. Germany, on the other hand, increasingly got into a war that it could no longer determine according to its own ideas. In the course of 1943, the Soviet side prepared further operations to push the German threat away from Leningrad once and for all. The city not only had to be supplied, but also freed from the range of direct shelling. As long as German guns could hit the city, everyday life remained marked by fear and destruction. At the same time, Leningrad had become a symbol whose liberation had significance far beyond the military situation. A city that had endured so long was not only to survive, but to be visibly saved. However, the final blow against the German positions required preparation, forces, supplies, and coordination between several fronts. In January 1944, the major Soviet offensive finally began. which led to the complete lifting of the siege. The Leningrad and Volkhov fronts attacked together with other forces and forced the German troops to retreat. The German lines, which had brought death, starvation, and shelling to the city for so long, were pushed back piece by piece. Places that had been part of the siege area for years were recaptured. The front moved away from Leningrad. What was a successful operation for military staffs meant something much bigger for the city. It meant that the direct lethal embrace ended. AM 27. January 1944 wurde die vollständige Aufhebung Belagerung offiziell geführt. In Leningrad wurden Salutschuss abgeführt. Für Menschen war dieser Tag kaum zu begreifen. Fast 900 Tage hat die Stadt unter Blockade, Hunger, Beschuss und Angst gestanden. Nun sollt es vorbei sein. Doch wie fühlt sich befreiungen, wenn die eigen Family tot ist, die Wohnung zerstört, der Körper geschwächt und die Zielvallerbilder, die nicht verschwinden? Freude und Trauer lagen beieinander. Es gab Menschen, die weinten vor Erleichterung. Andere konnten nicht mehr weinen. Manch dachten an die diesen Tag nicht mehr erlebt hatten. Jeder Jubel halt durch ein Stadt, in der unselige Stimmen fehlten. The liberation was therefore not an easy end, but a transition. The siege stopped, but its consequences remained. Roads, houses, factories, and supply systems were damaged. The human losses weighed even heavier. Families had to realize that return did not mean restoration. Children were without parents, parents without children, women without men, old people without whole branches of the family. Diseases, malnutrition, and mental exhaustion continued to have an effect. The city not only had to be rebuilt, it had to learn to live with a memory that was too big to be simply told. Nevertheless, January 1944 was a historic turning point. The German strategy of breaking Leningrad through hunger and isolation had failed. The city had not fallen. She had survived under unimaginable conditions. This survival was not the result of a single event, but of a long chain of military resistance, logistical effort, civilian endurance, state toughness, human solidarity, and pure will to survive. The road of life, the battles on the Neva, the work in the factories, the care in hospitals, the sacrifices of the soldiers, and the strength of the population combined to form a story that can be told neither purely heroically nor only tragically. She was both at the same time. The breakthrough and the end of the siege show how long historical catastrophes linger. A military victory can end a blockade, but it cannot bring back the dead. It can open up new paths, but it cannot erase the months of hunger, cold, and fear. For Leningrad, the liberation meant salvation, but it was a salvation from a state of affairs that had changed the city forever. People stood in front of ruins, graves, memories, and yet they had to go on living. Perhaps this is precisely the deepest meaning of this end. Leningrad was liberated not only because armies threw back the German lines. Leningrad was liberated because, despite everything, it still existed. A city that was to be wiped out had been wounded, but remained alive. Chapter 15: Afterlife of a Tragedy. When the siege of Leningrad ended in January 1944, the city was liberated, but not healed. The military ring had been blown up, the German troops had been pushed back, the immediate danger of starvation had passed. But a city that had lived almost 900 days under hunger, cold, shelling, and death could not simply return to peace as if only one difficult night had passed. Leningrad carried the siege further in its streets, in its buildings, in its families, and in the bodies of the survivors. The war was not over yet, but for Leningrad another, quieter battle was already beginning. The battle for memory, reconstruction, truth, and survival with losses that were hard to comprehend. The visible traces were everywhere. Houses were damaged, windows broken, facades marked by grenades, streets and squares exhausted from years of war. Factories had to be repaired, transport routes restored, apartments made habitable, and supply systems stabilized. But the heaviest destruction was not always visible. They were in the people. Many survivors were physically emaciated, sick, weakened, and aged, even though they were still young. Hunger does not disappear immediately when bread is available again. It remains in the body, in damaged organs, in permanent weakness, in a nervous relationship with food. Anyone who has ever experienced that a piece of bread makes the difference between life and death will never again see bread as just bread. The psychological wounds were even deeper. The survivors had seen things that could hardly be told. Family members who were slowly starving, children who were too weak to cry, dead people on sledges, apartments without warmth, neighbors who disappeared, people who collapsed on the streets. Many felt guilty even though they were not guilty. Why had I survived and others hadn't? Why couldn't I save my child, my mother, my brother? Why did I perhaps hide a piece of bread, not share it, not help it, because I could hardly do it myself? Such questions did not disappear with the end of the siege. They accompanied many people throughout their lives. At the same time, the Soviet state began very early to place the siege in a grand narrative. Leningrad became a heroic city. This designation was not empty. The city had indeed stood firm, its defenders had fought, its workers had produced, its drivers had driven across Lake Ladoga, its doctors, teachers, musicians and ordinary residents had carried on under unimaginable conditions. The courage was real. The sacrifices were real. The steadfastness was real. But every official heroic narrative also has a danger. It can smooth out suffering, cover up contradictions, and turn people into symbols. The hungry become heroes. The desperate become role models. A cruel experience becomes a national legend. For many survivors, this recognition was important. They wanted the world to know what Leningrad had endured. They did not want the dead to be forgotten. Monuments, commemorations, orders, books and speeches gave their suffering a place in history. But at the same time, not everything fit into this official memory. The chaotic evacuations, the unequal supply, the failure of some authorities, the black market, theft, despair, moral borderline situations, and criticism of decisions of the Soviet leadership were often only discussed to a limited extent. The truth was greater than the myth. It consisted not only of bravery, but also of fear, not only of solidarity, but also of loneliness, not only of victory but also of immeasurable loss. The memory of the siege therefore became a complicated space between pride and pain. In families, people often spoke differently than in public speeches. Some told their children and grandchildren about the road of life, about the Seventh Symphony, about liberation and perseverance. Others hardly talked about it. They kept their memories in silence, not because they had forgotten, but because remembering hurt too much. In some apartments, food never lay around carelessly again. Bread was not thrown away. Supplies were stockpiled. Children and grandchildren felt that the siege lived on in gestures, in the sparing cutting of a loaf of bread, in respect for food, in the sudden silence on certain questions, in the sadness on certain anniversaries. The number of victims of the siege is still one of the most harrowing dimensions of this history. Hundreds of thousands of people died, mainly from hunger, cold, disease, and shelling. Behind each number was a single life. A student who lost her mother. A worker who collapsed on the machine. A grandmother who gave her last ration to a child. A driver who disappeared on the ice of Lake Ladoga. A musician who became too weak to hold his instrument. Numbers can show the extent, but they can't fully support reality. The siege was not only a statistical catastrophe. It was a million-fold personal suffering. Even outside the Soviet Union, it took a long time for the siege of Leningrad to be perceived in its full significance. In many depictions of the Second World War, other events were more in the foreground: Stalingrad, the Normandy landings, the Holocaust, Berlin, Hiroshima. All these events are of enormous importance. But Leningrad shows a special form of National Socialist violence, the deliberate use of hunger against a big city. The siege forces us to view the war in the East not only as a struggle between armies, but as a war against entire societies. It makes it visible that military blockade, ideological contempt, and civilian mass death could belong together. After the war, Leningrad was rebuilt. The city regained its cultural power, Theaters and museums opened, factories worked, streets filled with people again. But reconstruction does not mean a return to the previous state. A city can get new facades and still carry its past within itself. The Hermitage, the prospects, the bridges over the Neva, the squares and cemeteries became the bearers of a double memory, of the ancient beauty of the city and of the time when this beauty was surrounded by hunger and death. Anyone who walked through Leningrad, later called St. Petersburg again, moved through a city that was both alive and scarred. Places of remembrance became particularly important. The Piskarevskoye Memorial Cemetery became a central place of remembrance. Hundreds of thousands of victims of the siege lie there in mass graves. Such places speak a different language than military victory monuments. They do not remind us of conquered heights or strategic maneuvers, but of the dead of a city. They make it clear that the siege was not just dates and operations, but bodies that had to be buried, families that did not have a single tombstone, names that sometimes disappeared. Anyone who stands in such places feels that history is not past as long as its dead still demand meaning. The afterlife of the siege extends to the present day, because it poses questions that go beyond Leningrad. What happens to people when a state forces them to hold out and an enemy determines them to die? How do you talk about courage without glorifying suffering? How do you remember victims without using them for political purposes? How do you talk about guilt, responsibility, and survival when reality is so complex? The siege demands a memory that is neither cold nor sentimental. It demands precision and compassion at the same time. Leningrad became a symbol of resistance, but this symbol must not swallow people. The city stood firm, yes, but it did not hold up as an abstract monument. It stood firm through people who starved, froze, worked, fought, loved, doubted, and died. It stood firm with mothers sharing bread, children fetching water, soldiers defending positions, drivers driving across the ice, doctors treating without sufficient resources, musicians playing despite exhaustion, and countless nameless people who had no place in grand narratives. It is precisely they who make history come true. The tragedy of Leningrad is a reminder that war is not only cruel when cities fall. Sometimes cruelty consists precisely in not taking a city, but letting it die slowly. The siege was a crime of intention and effect. It showed how hunger can become a weapon, how ideology destroys compassion, and how military language can cover up human suffering. But it also showed that even under extreme violence, people are not completely reduced to their weakness. In Leningrad there was collapse, but also dignity. There was death, but also care. There was silence, but also voices that can still be heard today. In the end, the siege of Leningrad is not a simple lesson. It is too big, too painful, too contradictory. It tells of an enemy who wanted to starve a city, of a state that demanded perseverance, and of people who had to survive between the two forces. It tells of guilt and sacrifice, of propaganda and truth, of culture and hunger, of military resistance and private suffering. Its afterlife consists in the fact that it forces us to take a closer look. Not just cards, commands, and data, but faces, hands, voices, and memories. Leningrad survived. But this survival was not an unbroken triumph. It was a survival with scars, with mass graves, with empty seats at family tables, with memories that did not pass. The city that was to be wiped out remained. But she remained as a witness. And perhaps therein lies its greatest significance. Leningrad reminds the world of where a war can lead when people are seen only as obstacles, numbers, or enemy images. The history of this siege is a reminder that humanity cannot be taken for granted. It must be defended, especially when hunger, fear, and power threaten to destroy it.